Harriet Tubman was born into the harsh reality of slavery in the early 1820s on a plantation in Maryland, where she would spend the first years of her life subjected to the cruelties of bondage. Yet, from these humble and painful beginnings arose a woman whose name would become synonymous with freedom, courage, and hope. Harriet's journey from the fields of slavery to the leadership of the Underground Railroad is a story not of loud triumphs, but of quiet, unwavering determination, a journey marked by resilience, faith, and an unyielding desire to help others escape the shackles of slavery. Her life unfolded through some of the most turbulent times in American history, yet her actions were always grounded in a deep sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that carried her through danger and uncertainty. As you listen to her story, let the rhythm of her journey guide you through the slow, steady march of history. Feel the peace of her courage, the calm strength in her actions, and the enduring legacy of her work as we drift gently through the life of Harriet Tubman. As you settle in, allow the soft unfolding of this narrative to bring you a sense of calm, and let the peaceful flow of Harriet Tubman's life carry you toward rest. Harriet Tubman was born around 1820 in the small, quiet town of Dorchester County, Maryland. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, but it was the name Harriet that would later become legendary. She was born to Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, both enslaved people. Her early life was shaped by the harsh realities of slavery, a system that dehumanized her family and kept them in a constant state of uncertainty. The very soil beneath her feet in Dorchester County, Maryland, was steeped in the weight of oppression, and it was here, amidst these conditions, that Harriet's story began. As a child, Araminta's world was narrow and defined by the strictures of slavery. Enslaved people had little control over their lives or bodies, and they were at the mercy of the whims of their owners. For the Ross family, survival meant perseverance. Though her parents were enslaved, they still tried to impart their values of strength, unity, and survival to their children. From a young age, Araminta learned the basic skills needed to survive in a world determined to crush her spirit. She helped her mother with household chores, and her father worked as a timberman. Yet, even as a young child, Araminta was keenly aware of the ways in which the world around her was designed to keep people like her in chains. She had seen the brutality that came with slavery, and it left an indelible mark on her heart. Life in the early years of Araminta's existence was filled with pain, suffering, and hardship. She was not exempt from the cruelty that was so prevalent in the lives of enslaved children. She was subjected to the harsh, often cruel discipline of the slave system. She had been born into a life of labor and servitude, a reality that offered little hope for change. At the age of 5, Araminta was hired out to work for the surrounding farms, a practice not uncommon among enslaved children. These early years were filled with the endless demands of hard labor, working the fields, doing household chores, and learning the laws of survival in an unforgiving world. Though she was young, Araminta developed a quiet but resolute understanding of the world that was shaping her. By the time Araminta was around 12 years old, she began to experience the violent, deeply unjust nature of slavery more personally. She was tasked with carrying out the orders of her master, which included working long hours in the fields. One fateful day, as she was sent to check on a runaway enslaved man, she suffered a significant injury. It was a moment that would mark the rest of her life. The overseer, a cruel man, struck her with a heavy metal weight. The injury left her unconscious and caused long-lasting damage to her head and body. This injury, though a physical trauma, would later become symbolic of the strength and endurance that would define her life. The incident was traumatic, but it also ignited in young Araminta a deep desire for freedom. Her quiet internal resolve began to grow, and her sense of injustice would eventually become a powerful catalyst for her escape. In her early years, it was clear that life would never be easy for her. Yet, from the very beginning, Harriet Tubman's strength began to take shape in the crucible of her pain and suffering. The seeds of defiance were sown, though they would not fully bloom for many years. Even in the face of these trials, Araminta was not without the support of her family. Her mother, Harriet Green, played a vital role in shaping Araminta's resilience. Harriet Green was known for her strength and determination, traits that Araminta would carry with her throughout her life. She was a mother who, despite the immense challenges of being enslaved, worked to provide for her children and instill in them the value of family. It was her influence that helped Araminta stay grounded in the face of adversity. Though young Araminta had little freedom, she began to imagine a different life. The weight of slavery bore heavily on her, and yet she held on to a quiet belief that escape might be possible. Little did she know at this time that her desire for freedom would one day transform her into a hero, leading hundreds of others to liberty, all while putting her own life in peril. Araminta's early years were defined by hardship, injustice, and violence. Her experiences shaped her into the woman who would become Harriet Tubman. Despite the world's attempt to break her spirit, she remained strong. The pain of her injury became a symbol of her endurance. In this quiet beginning, Harriet Tubman's journey toward freedom and justice began to unfold. Her story, though filled with suffering, was also one of quiet resistance. In the small moments, like helping her family or enduring hardship without breaking, Araminta's resolve to be free was growing, slowly and steadily. In the fields of Maryland, under the scorching sun, Harriet Tubman was being forged, bit by bit, day by day. From the pain of slavery, she was learning the quiet power of resilience, and it was this inner strength that would carry her through the darkest moments of her life. Harriet Tubman's early childhood was marked by the unyielding presence of slavery. Born on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, the land that she was born on would forever serve as a reminder of the cruelty and injustice that defined her early years. Araminta Ross, as she was then called, was raised in a world where human beings were treated as property, their worth measured by their ability to work the land and produce for their owners. In these early years, she had little sense of a world beyond the plantation. Yet, even as a small child, she began to notice the stark contrast between the world of the enslaved and the world of the free. Araminta's family lived in a small cabin separate from the master's house. The small space was shared with her parents and siblings, and it was there that she first learned the essential lessons of survival. In this world there was little room for luxury or indulgence. There was only the harsh reality of hard work and the ever-present threat of punishment. Yet, within this environment, a sense of solidarity developed between Harriet and her family. The bond between mother and child was strong, providing a quiet strength that would carry her through the darkest moments of her life. As a young child, Araminta's labor began early. Like other enslaved children, she was expected to contribute to the household from a very young age. Her chores included cleaning, cooking, and tending to the fields. These responsibilities were not unusual for children born into slavery, as their lives were shaped by the work that their owners demanded of them. Even before she could fully comprehend the depth of her bondage, Araminta learned that she was expected to serve, and serve well, for the good of the plantation. The physical demands placed on her were immense. As young as 6 years old, Araminta was expected to help with the fields, working under the hot sun and enduring long hours of labor. She was no stranger to back-breaking work, though the weight of the labor fell disproportionately on the enslaved children like herself. While she struggled under the weight of these duties, Araminta remained strong, holding her family together, quietly defying the system that sought to break her. Although her early years were filled with the hardships of fieldwork, Araminta also witnessed the tragic toll of slavery on the family's de-enslaved people. She saw how her parents and others like them suffered under the harsh conditions imposed by their masters. Enslaved people were not allowed to form stable families in the true sense of the word. Family members could be separated at any time, sold to different owners, or removed from the plantation entirely. For a child, this reality was difficult to understand, but it nonetheless left an indelible mark on Araminta. It was not just physical labor that shaped her childhood, but the emotional and psychological toll of knowing that the people she loved could be taken from her at any moment. Her experiences with cruelty also began to shape her understanding of the world around her. Though she was small and relatively powerless, Araminta began to develop a quiet defiance. She didn't understand everything about the larger system of slavery, but she recognized the injustice of it. Her young mind was slowly beginning to form the seed of resistance, a deep-rooted desire to be free. In the midst of this difficult existence, the small acts of defiance that Araminta witnessed around her were what gave her hope. The people around her, especially her mother, Harriet Green, taught her the importance of holding on to one's dignity and humanity, even in the face of extreme adversity. Harriet Green, Araminta's mother, was a woman of immense strength and compassion. She guided her children with a steady hand, instilling in them the values of endurance and courage. Her teachings would stay with Araminta for the rest of her life. Harriet's father, Benjamin Ross, was also a significant influence on her. Though he was enslaved, he was a strong, principled man, and he worked hard to provide for his family within the confines of slavery. His own quiet strength helped foster the resilient spirit that would define Araminta as she grew older. From both parents, Araminta learned how to survive in a world determined to suppress her. One of the things that would shape Araminta's childhood most profoundly was her connection to the land. Though she did not fully understand the complexities of slavery at such a young age, the land was a constant presence in her life. It was a place where she worked, where she played, and where she experienced both the hardship and occasional joy of childhood. The fields of Maryland were both a prison and a teacher, a constant reminder of the weight of her bondage, yet they also represented the freedom she would one day seek. The bond between Araminta and her family was unbreakable, and it was this love for her family that would later drive her to take extreme risks to secure their freedom. As a child, she didn't have the luxury of dreaming of a different life, for she was bound to the plantation, both physically and emotionally. But those bonds, while heavy, also nurtured the quiet strength that would fuel her determination to fight for liberty. Araminta's childhood on the plantation, though full of suffering, shaped the young woman she would become. Her family's strength, the lessons taught by her mother, and her own growing sense of injustice all contributed to the resilience that she would need later in life. These early years marked the beginning of her journey toward freedom, not just for herself, but for countless others. Despite the hardship and cruelty she faced, Harriet Tubman's childhood was also filled with moments of quiet resistance. Her deep connection to her family, her awareness of the injustice around her, and her burgeoning sense of self all began to shape her into the woman who would one day become one of the greatest heroes of the abolitionist movement. As Araminta Ross grew older, the weight of her life as an enslaved child only became more apparent. The harsh conditions of the plantation were no less severe in her adolescence. By the time Araminta was in her teenage years, the life of labor and suffering that she had known as a child had become a constant reality. Yet, it was in these formative years that the deeper connections with her family began to play a vital role in shaping her spirit. Araminta's relationship with her mother, Harriet Green, remained a cornerstone of her early life. Harriet Green was a woman of exceptional strength and resilience. Despite the crushing realities of slavery, she instilled in Araminta and her siblings the values of dignity, self-worth, and hope. Harriet Green was deeply protective of her children, always striving to keep them together, to shield them from the worst of the system that sought to tear their family apart. This connection between mother and child was sacred. forming the foundation of Araminta's determination to one day break free from the system of enslavement. Though Araminta's mother fought tirelessly to protect her children, the threat of separation was ever present. The horrific practice of selling enslaved people away from their families was an all-too-common reality for many black families in America. Araminta and her siblings were never guaranteed to remain together, and this constant fear of being separated by sale or violence weighed heavily on her mind. The thought of losing her family members, especially her mother, became a central motivating factor in Araminta's desire for freedom. During this time, Araminta's connection with her father, Benjamin Ross, also became significant. He was a man of quiet strength who worked hard as a timberman. While his family was enslaved, Benjamin found ways to carve out small moments of peace and stability for his children. He was not as physically present in their lives as Harriet Green, but his love and care were deeply felt. He too suffered under the system of slavery, but maintained a quiet determination to preserve his family's unity. His influence on Araminta was marked by his calm resolve and his unspoken belief in the possibility of a better life beyond slavery. Even as he worked tirelessly to support his family, he remained steadfast in his love for them, passing down a legacy of patience, resilience, and hope. The daily existence of the Ross family was shaped by the brutal demands of plantation life. Each day was filled with hard labor, ploughing fields, tending crops, and fulfilling the demands of their masters. For Araminta, these years were marked by long hours of grueling work, but she was also learning more than just how to survive. She was learning to navigate the precarious balance between submission and defiance, between surviving the system and quietly resisting it. Every task, no matter how small, was a reminder that the system of enslavement aimed to break their spirits. But Araminta and her family remained unbowed. Though enslaved, Araminta found solace in moments of respite when she was able to connect with her family. These moments were rare, but they were precious. They were times when the family would come together to share stories, bond over the simplest of joys, and nurture a sense of togetherness in the face of an oppressive world. These small moments of family unity were what kept Araminta's spirit alive. They were what kept her focused on the possibility of a different life, a life of freedom for herself and those she loved. Araminta also began to feel the first stirrings of her own inner strength during these years. The sheer determination that had been instilled in her by her mother and father began to crystallize into a deep, unshakable resolve. The emotional and physical toll of slavery weighed on her, but it did not break her. In fact, it seemed to fortify her, building the quiet, unwavering strength that would one day propel her to take the unimaginable risks she would take as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. This period in Araminta's life also served as a reminder of how the system of slavery worked to limit the potential of those it oppressed. Araminta, though growing into a strong young woman, was still restricted by the limitations imposed upon her. She was forced to serve her owners, working in the fields, enduring long days, and maintaining a level of obedience to the system that kept her in bondage. But even in this environment, she began to understand the system's weaknesses. She learned how to navigate the world of the plantation, observing how others around her resisted, however subtly, the forces of oppression. She began to internalize the belief that she, too, could one day escape this world of cruelty. The emotional toll of living in constant fear of separation was profound. At this time, Araminta began to form plans in her mind, not only to escape for herself, but to eventually help others. It was no longer enough to dream of her own freedom. She began to understand that her life had a higher purpose, and she would need to take action, not just for herself, but for the people she loved. It was in these formative years, in the deep connection to her family and the quiet observations of her surroundings, that Araminta's resolve to escape slavery began to take shape. In these years, Araminta's relationship with her family was a pillar of strength. It was their love and sacrifice that sustained her, and it was their shared dreams of a better life that would later drive her to undertake the dangerous missions that would bring freedom to hundreds of enslaved people. Though the world around her was full of suffering, her family's unity remained a beacon of hope that would guide her for the rest of her life. The quiet resistance and unspoken defiance Araminta witnessed in her family would become the foundation of the woman she would one day become, a woman who would dedicate her life to fighting for freedom. Through the struggles and sacrifices of her family, Araminta learned that freedom was worth fighting for no matter the cost. It was a lesson she would carry with her as she embarked on the dangerous journey that would one day make her one of the most celebrated heroes of American history. By the time Araminta Ross entered her teenage years, the brutality of the world around her had become more evident. In the early 1830s, she was still young, but the hard labor of the plantation had taken a toll on her body. She continued to help her mother and father, but the cruel system of slavery seemed to have no mercy, even for the youngest among them. Yet, during these early years, an event occurred that would alter the course of Araminta's life forever. At the age of 12, in 1834, Araminta was struck by a heavy metal weight. The incident happened when she was sent to do an errand for her master. The master's overseer, a cruel man who held no concern for the lives of enslaved people, threw the weight in an attempt to stop an escape attempt by another enslaved person. Araminta, in her effort to help, was struck in the head, rendering her unconscious. This blow left her with serious injuries that would affect her health for the rest of her life. The physical damage was severe. It caused debilitating headaches, dizziness, and disorientation, which she would live with for years. Despite the pain and injury, Araminta's spirit was not broken. If anything, this event seemed to sharpen her awareness of the injustice surrounding her. The injury she sustained marked the beginning of a personal awakening. As she lay in bed recovering from the incident, she began to reflect on the world around her. For the first time, she truly began to grasp the extent of the suffering enslaved people endured. Though still young, Araminta understood that something had to change. She recognized the brutality of slavery and the toll it took on not just the body, but the soul. Though the injury was physically painful, it also seemed to ignite something deeper in Araminta. She began to question the system that had allowed such cruelty to take place. Her injury brought the painful reality of slavery into stark focus for her, and she started to think not just of herself, but of the hundreds of others living under the same conditions. In her heart, she knew that there was only one way out: freedom. But that path was perilous, and it required not just a willingness to risk her life, but a desire to fight for others too. While recovering from the injury, Araminta's thoughts turned toward escape. The idea of freedom was not new to her. It had always been something she'd longed for in the quiet recesses of her mind. However, now, with the severity of the injury weighing on her, the thought of staying enslaved for the rest of her life became unbearable. The injury forced her to slow down, but it also allowed her time to plan and to reflect. She dreamed of a life beyond the plantation, of a life where she was not bound by the chains of slavery. In the months that followed, Araminta's health gradually improved, but the emotional toll of the injury was something she would carry with her forever. The incident left her with a constant reminder of the cruelty of the system that held her in bondage. But instead of succumbing to despair, she used this experience to fuel her determination. She realized that her path to freedom would not be an easy one, and that it would require more than just escaping the physical shackles of slavery. It would require strength, cunning, and a deep conviction to do what was necessary to free herself and others. During her recovery, Araminta's thoughts shifted toward her family. As she had feared, the possibility of being separated from her loved ones through sale was a constant threat. She'd heard stories of families being torn apart and never seeing each other again. The thought of being separated from her family pushed Araminta to the realization that her life and the lives of her loved ones depended on breaking free from slavery, the urgency to act became more pronounced, and in her heart Araminta knew that she would not be content to simply escape for herself. She would return again and again to help others achieve the same freedom she sought. The experience of the injury, though deeply traumatic, was a catalyst for Araminta's growth. It sharpened her resolve, heightened her awareness of the injustices surrounding her, and deepened her desire to fight for freedom, not just for herself, but for others as well. The suffering she endured only made her more determined to escape, and it would shape her future actions in ways she could not yet comprehend. As Araminta recovered from the injury, she also began to hone her understanding of the world around her. She quietly observed the ways in which other enslaved people resisted, both openly and covertly, whether it was through small acts of defiance or through quiet moments of rebellion. Araminta learned how to navigate the system that sought to keep her in chains. She began to see that resistance was not always loud or visible. It could be found in the smallest acts of defiance, in the refusal to accept the status quo. These lessons would prove invaluable in the years to come as she took on the dangerous mission of leading others to freedom. The injury that had once seemed like a devastating blow had, in many ways, become a turning point in Araminta's life. It was through the pain and the quiet time of reflection that Araminta realized the gravity of her situation and the steps she needed to take to achieve freedom. The mental and emotional awakening that followed would drive her to act. It would drive her to take risks, to become a leader, and to fight not only for her own liberation, but for the liberation of countless others. Araminta's injury, though a physical wound, served to awaken something far more powerful within her, a fire that would one day burn brightly as she fought to end the injustice of slavery. It was in this moment that Araminta Ross, the enslaved child, transformed into Harriet Tubman, the fearless conductor of the Underground Railroad. In 1844, at the age of 24, Araminta Ross, soon to adopt the name Harriet Tubman, married John Tubman, a free black man from nearby Madison, Maryland. The union marked an important chapter in her life, but it was also complicated by the circumstances of their different statuses. Harriet was still enslaved, while John, though free, could not offer her the liberty and autonomy she longed for. This chapter in Harriet's life was one of both love and struggle, as she navigated the realities of marriage under the oppressive conditions of slavery. Though their marriage was built on affection, the constraints of their respective positions in society made it difficult for Harriet to experience the full freedom that a marital bond might have offered in a different time and place. As an enslaved woman, Harriet did not have the ability to control her own life, let alone the life of her marriage. The relationship was marked by an inherent tension between freedom and bondage, and it became increasingly clear to Harriet that she would need to escape in order to truly live on her own terms. John Tubman, though a kind man, was unable to offer Harriet the escape she so desperately sought. Despite his love for her, the limitations imposed by slavery meant that Harriet had little hope of building a life of freedom alongside him. As a free man, John Tubman was allowed to move about more freely, but his actions were still constrained by the racist structures of society, and his relationship with Harriet was still subject to the whims of their respective masters. John's freedom, although a stark contrast to Harriet's enslavement, was not enough to offer her a real future. During this period of her life, Harriet began to feel the weight of the system more deeply than ever before. She saw firsthand how the lives of enslaved people were marked by uncertainty and vulnerability. Harriet was not only confronted by the immediate constraints of her own enslavement, but also by the possibility that her family could be torn apart. The fear of being sold away from her loved ones, the very people who meant the most to her, was a constant source of anxiety. As her relationship with John Tubman deepened, Harriet's growing awareness of her own status as an enslaved person fueled her desire for a different life. She realized that, despite her love for John, she could never be fully free while under the control of slavery. Harriet could not imagine a future where she would be subject to the whims of others, always at risk of being sold away or torn from the life she had built. This realization led Harriet to consider escape once again. She could no longer bear the thought of remaining in bondage, especially when the ties that bound her were stronger than ever before. Though her marriage to John Tubman was significant, it also served as a reminder of the limitations placed on her by slavery. In the quiet moments of reflection, she realized that the only way to truly live was to be free, to have the power over her own life and choices. Yet, as with many enslaved people, the path to freedom was fraught with peril. The system of slavery did not allow for such liberties, and the risks of attempting an escape were grave. Harriet knew that if she were caught, she would face severe punishment, perhaps even death. But despite these dangers, Harriet made the decision to act. Her longing for freedom and the constant fear of being separated from her family became stronger than any fear of punishment. In 1849, Harriet made the courageous decision to escape. She left her husband, her family, and the only life she had ever known, setting out for the unknown in search of freedom. Her escape was driven not only by her desire for her own liberty, but by the hope that, one day, she would be able to return and rescue others. Harriet Tubman's journey toward freedom began with a single decisive step away from the life she'd known, and the resolve to never again be subjected to the cruelty of slavery. During this period, Harriet made her first attempt to escape. Using the Underground Railroad, she traveled north to Philadelphia, where she found safety and freedom. It was a harrowing journey, filled with uncertainty and danger, but Harriet was guided by a deep inner resolve. The first few months of freedom were filled with both relief and disquiet. She'd escaped slavery, but she could not escape the lingering anxiety of her family's situation. In Philadelphia, she experienced the freedom that had once seemed like an unattainable dream, but it also brought with it the realization that her work was far from over. Harriet knew that her purpose was not simply to free herself, but to free others who remained in bondage. Once in Philadelphia, Harriet was able to reflect on the life she'd left behind, and she made a solemn vow to return to the South. Her mission was clear. She would help other enslaved people find their way to freedom, just as she had done. Her courage and determination had already carried her this far, and she knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But Harriet Tubman was not one to shy away from hardship. She would risk her life, again and again, to bring freedom to others. In the following years, Harriet returned to Maryland, crossing the dangerous border between the North and the South multiple times, to rescue family members and others enslaved in the South. The Underground Railroad became the vehicle for Harriet's mission, and she made several trips back to the South, risking her life each time in order to free others. She became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. Known for her courage, resourcefulness, and unwavering commitment to the cause, her decision to leave behind her family and life to undertake these dangerous journeys became the foundation of her legacy as a fierce fighter for freedom. The choices she made during this period were instrumental in shaping the path she would follow for the rest of her life. Harriet Tubman's escape to Philadelphia was just the beginning of her extraordinary journey. Upon her arrival in the free North, she found the freedom she had longed for, but soon realized that it was incomplete. Though she'd escaped the physical shackles of slavery, her heart remained tied to the people she left behind. Her family, her loved ones, and the many enslaved people still trapped in the South called to her, and Harriet's sense of justice and love for her people would not allow her to rest. Despite the newfound safety she found in Philadelphia, Harriet's thoughts were never far from her family in Maryland. She feared that they too would be sold away, separated and forced to endure the brutal realities of slavery. The trauma of seeing families torn apart, of being born into a system that demanded such separation lingered in Harriet's mind. So, driven by a fierce love for her family and a powerful desire to help others, Harriet made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would return to the South and bring others to freedom. In 1850, Harriet began her first rescue mission, a journey that would set the stage for her role as one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. With the help of abolitionists and sympathetic allies, Harriet worked to devise a plan to rescue her family and others still enslaved. The journey was fraught with danger, and Harriet knew that the risks of being caught were grave. Yet, the possibility of rescuing her loved ones outweighed the fear. Harriet's resolve was clear. She could not leave them behind, and she would not let them remain enslaved. As she crossed back into the South, Harriet was guided by the same steely determination that had carried her during her own escape. She used the knowledge she'd gained from her time in Philadelphia, how to navigate in secrecy, how to move under cover of darkness, and how to rely on the Underground Railroad's network of safe houses and hidden routes. Harriet was resourceful, utilizing her sharp instincts and her deep knowledge of the landscape to help guide her family and others to freedom. Her first mission was a success. Harriet was able to rescue her brother, Ben, and 2 other enslaved men. She led them through the perilous journey northward, moving stealthily, taking great care to avoid detection. Along the way, Harriet relied on her ability to blend in, to act with calm confidence, and to navigate the dangerous landscape with intelligence and quiet strategy. Each step she took brought her closer to the north, but the threat of capture never waned. Despite the ever-present danger, Harriet pushed forward, determined to achieve her goal. The successful rescue was a moment of great triumph for Harriet, but it was also a sobering reminder of the reality of the mission she'd undertaken. The path she had chosen was not only dangerous, but required constant vigilance and resourcefulness. Harriet knew that every mission carried immense risks, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were dire. If Harriet were caught, she could be sold back into slavery or worse. After rescuing her brother and the 2 men, Harriet continued to feel the pull of her mission. Her work was far from over, and she could not stop now. Harriet's determination to bring freedom to as many enslaved people as possible would lead her to return to the South again and again, each time at great personal risk. She became known for her courage, her commitment to the cause, and her unwavering belief that every person deserved to live in freedom. This first rescue mission was a powerful statement of Harriet's resilience and commitment to the cause of liberation. It was also the beginning of her life as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a role that she would undertake for the next decade. Harriet's courage was rooted in a deep, unwavering sense of purpose, the knowledge that her freedom was incomplete as long as others remained enslaved. Her decision to act, to risk everything in order to bring others to freedom, marked the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would change the course of history. As Harriet continued her work, she became a trusted figure in the abolitionist movement. Her reputation spread, and people began to recognize her not only for her courage, but for her ability to lead others to safety. Harriet's work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad was not just about escaping slavery. It was about challenging the system that allowed such cruelty to exist. Her efforts were part of a larger movement, a movement that sought to dismantle the institution of slavery and create a world where all people could live free from the shackles of oppression. In the years that followed, Harriet would make more than a dozen dangerous trips back to the South, rescuing enslaved people and guiding them to freedom. Each trip was fraught with danger, and each mission tested her resolve. But Harriet never faltered. The thought of those still in bondage fueled her determination, and the love for her family and fellow human beings drove her to risk everything for their freedom. She understood the dangers, but the freedom of others was worth any price. After her first successful rescue mission in 1850, Harriet Tubman became one of the most trusted and effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. This clandestine network of abolitionists, free people, and sympathetic allies helped guide enslaved individuals to freedom, often under the cover of darkness and through dangerous secret routes. Harriet's personal experiences with slavery made her uniquely qualified to navigate the perilous journey from the South to the North, and she became the most famous conductor in the system. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad, but rather a series of hidden routes and safe houses, many of them known only to a select few. These routes stretched from the southern states where slavery was entrenched, to the northern states and Canada where enslaved people could be free. Abolitionists, both black and white, worked in secret to protect and assist the escapees, providing food, shelter and guidance as they travelled through the darkness of night, avoiding slave catchers and bounty hunters. The success of the Underground Railroad was built on trust, secrecy, and the bravery of people like Harriet Tubman. Harriet's own journey on the Underground Railroad was marked by an unparalleled resolve. She used her intimate knowledge of the South, its geography, its social structure, and its systems of control to help guide enslaved people to freedom. Over the course of about a decade, Harriet made approximately 13 dangerous trips back to the South, rescuing over 70 enslaved people and leading them to safety. She was known for her cleverness, her ability to keep her group calm and focused, and her unwavering commitment to the cause. During these years, Harriet's network of safe houses and trusted allies grew. She worked with people like Thomas Garrett, a Quaker abolitionist in Delaware, and William Still, an African-American abolitionist in Philadelphia, who helped to organize the escapees and provide the necessary resources. The network was vast and intricately woven, relying on the dedication of many individuals, both black and white, who risked their own lives to help others. Harriet's approach to the Underground Railroad was methodical and precise. She understood the risks involved, both for herself and for the people she was rescuing. She kept her routes secret, often changing them from trip to trip, and relied on a combination of natural landmarks, knowledge of the land, and her keen instincts to find the safest paths. At times, she had to use disguises to avoid detection. On several occasions, she was nearly caught by slave catchers or bounty hunters, but she managed to evade them through her calm, collected demeanor and her ability to think quickly under pressure. Despite the constant danger, Harriet never hesitated to go back to the South. She had a deep sense of responsibility to those she'd left behind, especially her family. On each trip, Harriet took the same risks, travelled the same dangerous paths, and endured the same hardships. She knew that she was risking not only her own life, but the lives of everyone she helped. And yet, each time she returned, she brought more people to freedom. Her courage and her ability to stay focused in the face of such grave danger made her an invaluable asset to the Underground Railroad. One of the most remarkable aspects of Harriet's role as a conductor was her ability to inspire confidence and trust in those she helped. Many of the individuals she rescued had never left the plantations, and the journey to freedom was an unknown and terrifying path. Yet, Harriet's calm demeanor and steady leadership gave them the strength to continue. She would often tell the people she rescued, "I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." Her words, spoken with the quiet confidence that came from her own experience, gave her charges the courage they needed to keep going, even in the darkest moments. One of Harriet's most famous rescues took place in 1856, when she led a group of 8 people from Maryland to Philadelphia. The journey was perilous, but Harriet's careful planning and her ability to move quickly and efficiently made the mission a success. On this trip, she also freed her sister and her children, marking a deeply personal moment in her work. Harriet's commitment to her family was evident, and her personal connections made her even more determined to bring others to freedom. The risks Harriet faced on the Underground Railroad were not only physical but emotional. The uncertainty of each journey, the constant threat of capture, and the emotional toll of seeing others suffer weighed heavily on her. Yet, she never wavered in her commitment. She often spoke of her faith as a source of strength, believing that God had given her the mission to lead others to freedom. She trusted her instincts and her sense of purpose, and it was this deep conviction that carried her through the hardships of the Underground Railroad. By the end of the 1850s, Harriet had become a legendary figure in the abolitionist movement. Her actions had inspired countless others, and her success in rescuing so many enslaved people demonstrated the power of courage and determination. She was not just a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but a symbol of hope for all those who longed for freedom. Harriet's role in the Underground Railroad was pivotal, and her work laid the foundation for the broader movement to abolish slavery in America. Though Harriet's work was far from over, the 1850s were a time of increasing tension in the United States. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 made it even more dangerous for runaway slaves to escape to freedom, as it required people in the North to return runaway slaves to their owners. Despite this, Harriet continued her work, undeterred by the new law. She knew that the risk of capture was ever present, but she also knew that the fight for freedom was worth any price. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 marked a pivotal moment in the history of the United States, and for Harriet Tubman, it would open new avenues through which she could continue her fight for freedom. By this time, she had already made her mark as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, rescuing dozens of enslaved people from the grip of slavery. But with the war sweeping across the nation, the landscape of the abolitionist struggle was changing rapidly, and Harriet Tubman's role would evolve as well. Harriet's commitment to the Union cause was immediate and unflinching. With the war creating new opportunities to combat the institution of slavery, she saw a chance to make an even greater impact. Though she had already risked her life countless times in her missions on the Underground Railroad, the Civil War presented an entirely new set of challenges and possibilities. Harriet did not hesitate. She recognized that her deep knowledge of the Southern landscape, her familiarity with the routes slaves had taken to freedom, and her experiences leading people to safety would make her an invaluable asset to the Union Army. In 1862, Harriet traveled to South Carolina, where she began working as a nurse and cook for Union soldiers. The conditions in the camps were poor, and the men were often ill or wounded. But Harriet's deep faith and resourcefulness made her a valuable member of the team. She cared for the sick, provided food and comfort to the soldiers, and used her knowledge of herbs and healing to treat their ailments. It was here that she began to develop the skills that would later serve her in more direct combat roles. Harriet's service in the Union Army was not limited to nursing, however. Her knowledge of the South, including its geography and its people, made her an ideal candidate for more active roles. Harriet knew the terrain, the waterways, and the systems of control that governed Southern life, and she began to work closely with Union military leaders. As a scout and spy for the Union Army, she gathered intelligence on Confederate troops and helped organize raids to free enslaved people still in the South. One of her most notable contributions came in 1863, when she was asked to lead an armed expedition to the Combahee River in South Carolina. This mission, which is now one of the most celebrated chapters of Harriet Tubman's life, involved leading a group of soldiers and former enslaved people on a daring raid to destroy Confederate supply lines and free enslaved individuals. Harriet's deep understanding of the South and her remarkable courage enabled her to lead the raid with precision. The operation was a resounding success, freeing over 700 enslaved people and capturing valuable Confederate supplies. Harriet's leadership during the Combahee River raid earned her widespread recognition and cemented her place as one of the most effective figures in the Union Army's efforts to undermine slavery. For Harriet, this success was not just a military victory but a deeply personal triumph. The raid symbolized her lifelong mission to free enslaved people, and she saw it as a direct way to dismantle the institution of slavery while simultaneously contributing to the Union war effort. Her belief in the power of direct action to liberate individuals and strike at the heart of the Confederate war effort was a defining aspect of her service during the Civil War. In addition to her work as a scout and spy, Harriet continued to serve as a nurse and a moral support to the Union soldiers. Her contributions were invaluable in the larger war effort, and her work was deeply appreciated by the soldiers and officers with whom she worked. Though she was often on the front lines, facing great danger, Harriet's demeanour remained calm and focused. She never lost sight of her ultimate goal, the destruction of slavery. Despite her deep commitment to the Union cause, Harriet was never fully embraced by the military establishment. As a black woman, her contributions were often overlooked or undervalued. The army was still deeply segregated, and many officers were reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of Harriet's contributions. But her tireless service, her bravery, and her unwavering resolve made it impossible to ignore her impact. Harriet Tubman's work during the Civil War proved not only her devotion to the cause of freedom, but also her ability to lead and inspire others, even in the most trying of circumstances. By the time the Civil War came to a close in 1865, Harriet Tubman had made a significant and lasting contribution to the fight for freedom. Though the war had ended, the struggle for equality and justice was far from over. Harriet had helped to pave the way for the abolition of slavery, but her work was just beginning. She'd already risked everything to help enslaved people gain their freedom, but she knew that much remained to be done. In the years that followed, Harriet continued her activism. She fought for the rights of former enslaved people, advocated for women's suffrage, and worked to ensure that the gains made during the war would not be undone. Her life's work, shaped by her experiences as a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a member of the Union Army, would continue to inspire future generations to fight for justice, freedom, and equality. The end of the Civil War in 1865 marked a time of profound change for the United States. But for Harriet Tubman, it was also the beginning of a new chapter in her lifelong struggle for justice. Though slavery had been officially abolished with the 13th Amendment, Harriet knew that freedom was not truly realized as long as the systems of oppression and inequality persisted. The war had ended, but the journey for equality, particularly for newly freed African Americans, was far from over. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Harriet Tubman found herself living in Auburn, New York, where she had purchased a small plot of land. She established a home for herself and soon became deeply involved in advocating for the rights of formerly enslaved people. Despite the freedom that the war had ostensibly won, the conditions for African Americans in the post-war South remained dire. Harriet, ever the fighter, believed that the war had been just the first step toward liberation. The true work of freedom lay in securing equal rights and ensuring that African Americans could live lives of dignity, justice, and opportunity. One of the causes Harriet became most passionate about during this period was the education and welfare of freedmen. She understood that knowledge and access to resources were key to empowering the newly freed population. Harriet worked with local groups to establish schools and teach formerly enslaved people how to read and write. She also worked tirelessly to provide food, shelter, and medical care to those in need. For Harriet, freedom was not simply the absence of slavery. It was the opportunity to live a full and meaningful life, free from the constraints that had previously kept African Americans in bondage. As the Reconstruction era unfolded, however, it became clear that the promise of freedom for African Americans was being undermined by discriminatory laws and social structures. The passage of the Black Codes in southern states, which sought to restrict the newly won rights of African Americans, left Harriet deeply troubled. She saw firsthand the ways in which the government was failing to fully protect the rights of freedmen, and she knew that the fight for equality would continue long after the war had ended. Harriet's advocacy extended beyond the realms of education and welfare. She also became an ardent supporter of women's suffrage, working alongside leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Harriet believed that the cause of women's rights and the cause of African American rights were inextricably linked. She understood that true equality could only be achieved when all people, regardless of race or gender, were granted the same rights and opportunities. In speeches and public appearances, Harriet spoke passionately about the importance of women's suffrage, sharing her experiences of fighting for justice and equality, and urging others to join her in the struggle. During this time, Harriet also began to experience the physical toll of her years of hard work and sacrifice. The injuries she had sustained during her time as an enslaved person and later as a soldier in the Civil War began to catch up with her. Chronic pain from her head injury, as well as complications from her demanding work on the Underground Railroad, began to make it difficult for her to continue her physical labor. Yet even as her body weakened, her resolve remained strong. She knew that the battle for equality was far from over, and she continued to use her voice and influence to advocate for those who'd been left behind by the changing political landscape. In the 1870s, Harriet also became involved in veterans' affairs, working to ensure that black soldiers who had fought in the Civil War received the pensions and recognition they deserved. Harriet herself had never received a pension for her service, though she'd risked her life repeatedly for the Union cause. She knew that the contributions of black soldiers were often overlooked, and she fought for justice on their behalf. Despite the obstacles she faced, including racial prejudice within the government, Harriet remained undeterred. She used her public platform to draw attention to the plight of black veterans and worked tirelessly to secure their rightful recognition and compensation. In her later years, Harriet also found herself advocating for Native American rights, recognizing that the struggles of different oppressed groups were interconnected. She supported the rights of Native Americans to their land and sovereignty, and became involved in campaigns to provide them with the support and resources they needed to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. Throughout this period, Harriet's personal life remained marked by hardship. In 1869, she married Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran, and the couple adopted a child. Although she found comfort in her family, her work for justice never ceased. She continued to speak out on behalf of those who were marginalized and oppressed, and her actions, though often quiet and behind the scenes, made a lasting impact on the lives of those she touched. Harriet's post-war life was filled with the moments of deep reflection as she processed the incredible events she had witnessed and participated in. She had lived through slavery, fought in the Civil War, helped hundreds of people escape to freedom, and now found herself in the midst of a new battle for civil rights. Though the political landscape had shifted, Harriet's commitment to the cause of justice remained steadfast. She understood that the fight for freedom was a continuous one, and she devoted herself to advocating for those who had not yet achieved true equality. Despite the challenges and setbacks she faced, Harriet Tubman never wavered in her belief that freedom was a birthright for all people. Her courage, compassion, and determination were unwavering, and she continued to fight for justice in every way she could, even as her body grew frail with age. While Harriet Tubman's heart and spirit remained unbroken, her later years were marked by a series of financial struggles that seemed in stark contrast to her monumental contributions to both the abolitionist movement and the Union cause. Despite the fame she gained from her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad and her role in the Civil War, Harriet found herself facing poverty in the years following the end of the war. The financial rewards for her tireless efforts were non-existent, and she was left to navigate life with little income or security. After the war, Harriet had used the money she had saved and the small pension from the government to buy land in Auburn, New York, where she made her home. However, her land was modest, and despite her fame, Harriet did not receive the financial compensation she deserved for her years of service. The fact that she had risked her life to rescue others and played such a pivotal role in the war seemed to mean little in the face of the financial realities she faced. Harriet's land, though a place of comfort for her and her new husband, Nelson Davis, was not enough to provide long-term security. Harriet's health, which had been affected by the injuries she sustained during her time as a slave and her service in the war, also began to decline, making it harder for her to support herself. The chronic pain she endured from her head injury, which had been inflicted during her teenage years, continued to affect her life. Moreover, her work as a nurse, scout, and spy during the war had taken a toll on her body that she could not escape. Though she had given so much of herself to the cause of freedom, she found herself in a position where she could barely make ends meet. Despite the difficulty of her situation, Harriet never lost sight of the work that needed to be done. While struggling financially, she continued to fight for those who were still oppressed, especially the black community and former slaves. Her advocacy for former slaves, for their rights to land and the support they needed to rebuild their lives, remained unwavering. Harriet worked tirelessly to raise funds for education, housing, and basic necessities for those who'd been left behind by the promises of freedom. In addition to her struggles with poverty, Harriet continued to face the challenges of being a black woman in a society that was deeply entrenched in racial prejudice. The recognition she had gained for her work on the Underground Railroad and her service to the Union was not always enough to open doors for her, particularly in the post-war years when the federal government's commitment to Reconstruction began to wane. Harriet worked with various organizations and individuals to raise awareness of the issues faced by newly freed people, but the lack of financial support made it all the more difficult to effect change. During this time, Harriet also began to care for elderly and orphaned relatives, often taking on the responsibility of their well-being despite her own struggles. Her home in Auburn became a place of refuge for those in need, and she continued to give of herself even when she had so little to give. This selflessness, which had been a hallmark of her character throughout her life, was evident as she worked to support the most vulnerable members of her community. One of Harriet's most notable efforts during this period was her involvement with the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency established by the federal government to assist formerly enslaved people. Harriet worked with the Bureau to provide aid to newly freed people, helping them secure land, work, and education. Despite the limited resources available to her, Harriet remained committed to seeing the promises of freedom fulfilled, and she spent years advocating for those who had not yet achieved true independence. Though Harriet was deeply committed to the cause, her personal financial situation remained a significant obstacle. She never sought fame or fortune for her work, but it was clear that she had been overlooked and undervalued by the very system that she had helped to change. The lack of financial support and recognition from the government left Harriet to rely on the support of her family, friends, and the small donations of individuals who appreciated her work. Despite the hardship she faced, Harriet never lost her sense of hope. Her belief in the power of community, in the importance of collective action, and in the possibility of a better future kept her going. She continued to speak out on behalf of the oppressed, using her voice to advocate for justice and equality. Harriet understood that the battle for freedom was not a battle that could be won in a single lifetime. It was a continuous struggle that required persistence, courage, and determination. Harriet's later years were filled with the quiet dignity of someone who had given everything for the cause of freedom and had received little in return. Yet, despite her struggles with poverty, she remained steadfast in her commitment to the liberation of others. Her work, even in the face of adversity, laid the foundation for the future civil rights movements that would emerge in the 20th century. Harriet Tubman's legacy, built on courage, selflessness, and an unwavering belief in justice, continued to inspire generations of activists who would carry forward the torch she had ignited. Though she struggled financially, Harriet Tubman's life was a testament to the power of perseverance, love, and the indomitable human spirit. Her ability to continue fighting for justice, even when faced with poverty and personal hardship, remains one of the most powerful aspects of her legacy. As Harriet Tubman entered the 1880s, the fight for justice and equality continued to shape her life, but now her focus expanded to include the rights of women, particularly in the suffrage movement. While she'd long been an advocate for the freedom and rights of African Americans, Harriet recognized that the struggle for equality was incomplete as long as women were denied the right to vote. Her own experience as a woman who had fought against the systemic oppression of both slavery and gender inequality gave her a unique perspective on the need for women's rights to be part of the broader struggle for social justice. The 19th century was a time of great upheaval for women in the United States. While slavery had been abolished in 1865, many women, particularly African American women, still faced discrimination and legal restrictions that severely limited their freedom and opportunity. Women's suffrage, the right to vote, became a central issue for many reformers, and as the movement gained momentum, Harriet Tubman became increasingly involved. Harriet was not alone in her advocacy for women's rights. She worked alongside prominent suffragists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, both of whom recognized Harriet as a powerful ally. While the women's suffrage movement was predominantly led by white women in the North, Harriet brought her own experience and insight into the fight, emphasizing the importance of securing the vote for all women, including black women, who were often excluded from these discussions. Though Harriet was not formally educated in the ways of political organizing or public speaking, she brought her lived experience as a freedom fighter to the suffrage movement. Her personal history of resistance, having fought for the freedom of herself and others from the shackles of slavery, became a key part of her appeal in the suffrage movement. Her life story resonated with both black and white women, as she was seen as a symbol of strength and resilience, and she demonstrated that the fight for equality was not only about changing laws, but about changing minds and hearts. Harriet Tubman's commitment to women's suffrage was not limited to public speeches or advocating for policy change. She understood that true progress would require women to be empowered not just politically, but economically and socially. She worked to improve the lives of poor women, particularly black women, who faced multiple layers of oppression due to both their race and their gender. Harriet continued her advocacy for their welfare, including the establishment of community programs and education initiatives to help women become more self-sufficient and independent. Her own life story of overcoming adversity, enduring hardship, and fighting for what was right made her a compelling figure in the suffrage movement. Harriet's fame as a former conductor of the Underground Railroad, as a soldier, and as a champion for the rights of African Americans added weight to her words and actions. While she was not the most visible figure in the national suffrage movement, Harriet's involvement lent important credibility to the cause, particularly among African Americans, who were often marginalized in these discussions. Although Harriet's health began to decline in the 1880s, she remained deeply committed to the cause of women's suffrage and the larger fight for equality. She participated in various suffrage meetings and gatherings, lending her voice to the call for women's rights. She continued to be a passionate advocate for the idea that freedom and equality must include both gender and race, and that the movement for women's rights could not afford to overlook the struggles of African American women. Harriet made it clear that the work of securing the vote for women was a fight that should include all women, no matter their race, class, or background. Harriet's advocacy for women's suffrage was part of her lifelong commitment to justice and equality for all people. Her belief in the interconnectedness of various struggles for civil rights, the fight for the rights of African Americans, women, and marginalized groups, was a key component of her activism. In the suffrage movement, Harriet saw an opportunity to extend her vision of freedom and equality beyond the abolition of slavery, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that women were not excluded from the rights that every human being deserved. While the victory for women's suffrage would not come until the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, 7 years after Harriet's death, her contributions were crucial in laying the groundwork for that moment. Harriet Tubman, in her quiet and unwavering way, demonstrated that the struggle for justice was not limited to a single cause, but was a movement that demanded a recognition of the worth and dignity of all human beings. Her involvement in the suffrage movement helped to remind those fighting for equality that true freedom was inclusive and could not be won without the full participation of women, particularly women of colour. Harriet Tubman's advocacy for women's suffrage remains one of the many ways in which she made an indelible mark on American history. She knew that the fight for freedom was never a single battle. It was an ongoing struggle that required continued perseverance. Harriet's legacy in the suffrage movement serves as a reminder of the power of activism, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the belief that freedom and equality must extend to all people, regardless of their gender, race, or background. As Harriet Tubman entered her later years, she found herself facing challenges not only from external forces but from within. The tireless work she had done throughout her life, first as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, then as a nurse, scout, and spy during the Civil War, had taken a physical toll on her body. The injuries she'd sustained as a child, including the head injury inflicted by an overseer when she was young, began to worsen, and the chronic pain she'd endured for years became more unbearable. Yet, despite her declining health, Harriet's spirit remained as resilient as ever. By the 1890s, Harriet Tubman was no longer the young, vigorous woman who had once risked her life repeatedly to guide enslaved people to freedom. Her body, worn down by years of hardship and sacrifice, began to show the toll of her work. Harriet suffered from severe headaches, dizziness, and a variety of other health complications. The effects of the head injury from her youth, combined with the exhausting physical labour she had endured throughout her life, caused her significant distress. Harriet had long been accustomed to living with pain, but now it was more difficult to bear. Yet even in the face of her health struggles, Harriet's commitment to the causes she cared about remained steadfast. Though her physical strength had diminished, her mind and her heart remained focused on the needs of those around her. Harriet continued to advocate for the rights of freedmen, for women's suffrage, and for the welfare of the black community despite her health issues. In these years, Harriet began to receive some recognition for her work, though it came far too late. Throughout her life, she'd been largely overlooked, and her contributions had often been undervalued by both the government and the public. However, as she grew older, some began to realize the magnitude of her accomplishments. In 1899, Harriet was granted a pension by the federal government for her service during the Civil War. This pension, though small, provided some financial relief, and for the first time, Harriet began to receive the recognition she had long deserved. The struggle for a pension had been difficult, and Harriet had fought for years to secure the compensation she felt was rightfully hers. Finally, in her later years, she received some measure of justice. Despite her health struggles, Harriet remained a source of inspiration and strength for those around her. She continued to visit Washington, D.C., to advocate for the causes she cared about. Her work with the elderly and orphan children also continued. She took it upon herself to care for those who had nowhere else to turn. Harriet's home in Auburn became a refuge for the poor, and she welcomed those in need, offering them a safe place to stay, food to eat, and her counsel. She continued to fight for the rights of the oppressed, working with various organizations to support the needs of the black community and to help those in poverty. In addition to her activism, Harriet Tubman became involved in raising money for her own care and for the care of others. She was determined to use the resources she had to continue her work, even as her health worsened. She was also active in campaigns to help fund the establishment of a home for elderly black people, ensuring that they would have a place to live out their final years with dignity. Harriet's health issues, while challenging, did not diminish her sense of purpose. She was a woman who had spent her entire life defying the odds, and she was determined to do so until her last breath. She was often described by those who knew her as a woman of immense courage, even in the face of personal hardship. Her strength was not only physical, but spiritual and emotional as well. Harriet's faith played an important role in her ability to endure the pain and suffering she faced in her later years. She was deeply religious and believed that her work had been guided by a higher power. She saw her life's mission as a divine calling, and this sense of purpose helped her continue her advocacy for justice, even when she struggled with illness. Though Harriet was no longer physically able to engage in the activism that had defined much of her life, she continued to make her voice heard. She wrote letters, participated in meetings, and spoke to those who came to her seeking guidance. Harriet's life story, her experiences, and her wisdom became invaluable tools in the fight for freedom and equality. She became a living testament to the power of resilience and determination, showing the world that even in the face of physical limitations, a person's will to do good can remain strong. As Harriet Tubman entered her final years, her legacy began to take shape. The country that she had helped change through her work on the Underground Railroad and her service in the Civil War was beginning to realize the depth of her contributions. Her legacy as one of the greatest freedom fighters in American history was solidifying, and her name became synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and selflessness. Though Harriet's health continued to decline, she never stopped advocating for the rights of others. Her life's work continued to inspire generations of activists and leaders who would carry forward the torch she had lit. Harriet Tubman's story is a testament to the power of perseverance, to the belief that no matter how difficult the journey, one must never give up on the pursuit of justice and freedom. As Harriet Tubman entered the 1890s, her life continued to be defined by an unwavering commitment to helping others, even as she faced her own personal struggles. The hardships of her earlier years had taken their toll, but Harriet's desire to serve and uplift those around her remained strong. Despite her declining health, Harriet found purpose in caring for the elderly and orphaned, individuals who, like herself, had faced immense hardship and whose lives were now at risk of being forgotten by society. Throughout her life, Harriet had always been deeply connected to her community. Whether as a conductor on the Underground Railroad or as a nurse and spy during the Civil War, she had spent her years working to improve the lives of others, even when doing so came at great personal cost. Now, in her later years, her focus shifted to those most in need, the elderly, orphaned children, and the poor. Harriet's work with these vulnerable groups served as an extension of her lifelong commitment to providing care and support to the most marginalized members of society. One of the most significant aspects of Harriet's later years was her establishment of a home for elderly African Americans. With the financial support of various individuals and organizations, Harriet was able to secure funds for a project that would provide a safe haven for elderly black men and women who had no place to live. The home would serve as a sanctuary for those who had been left behind by a society that had failed to meet their needs. Harriet's vision for this home was simple yet profound. It was a place where people who had given so much of themselves throughout their lives could live out their remaining years with dignity and care. The establishment of the home for the elderly was not the only way Harriet continued to serve her community. She also provided care for orphaned children, many of whom were left vulnerable after the Civil War and its aftermath. Harriet had long understood the importance of providing education and care to children, especially those who'd been born into the harsh realities of slavery. In the face of personal financial struggle, she made sure that these children had access to food, clothing, and shelter. She also worked to teach them the values that had guided her throughout her own life: the importance of hard work, resilience, and the unshakable belief in one's own worth. Even though Harriet's health was fragile during this period, her commitment to these causes never faltered. The physical toll of her years of labour, both in the fields as a young child and later as a soldier and conductor on the Underground Railroad, had left her with ongoing health issues. Yet she persisted in her work with the elderly and orphaned, finding joy and meaning in these acts of service. She often took the time to visit the people she helped, offering words of encouragement and reminding them that they too deserved dignity and respect, regardless of the hardships they had faced. Though Harriet's own financial situation remained strained, she never allowed her lack of resources to stop her from helping others. She continued to rely on the support of friends, allies, and charitable organizations to fund her efforts, but it was her unyielding belief in the importance of community that kept her going. The home for the elderly and her work with orphaned children became a testament to her lifelong commitment to service, and her legacy as a compassionate advocate for the disenfranchised began to take shape. In addition to her work with the elderly and orphaned, Harriet continued to advocate for the rights of African Americans in the post-war years. She remained a vocal critic of the racial inequality that persisted in the United States, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow laws were taking root. Harriet's efforts to ensure that the rights of black people were protected were unceasing, and she often spoke out against the systemic racism that still plagued the nation. Despite the barriers she faced as a black woman in a deeply segregated society, Harriet continued to use her platform to advocate for justice and equality for all people, regardless of race. Throughout her life, Harriet had seen firsthand the devastating effects of racism and segregation, and she refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Even as she grew older and struggled with health issues, Harriet remained a tireless advocate for the rights of African Americans, particularly the elderly, children, and others who were most vulnerable to exploitation and neglect. Her work in this area was a natural extension of her earlier advocacy for the abolition of slavery, as she recognized that freedom meant little without the opportunity for equality, education, and opportunity. In the final years of her life, Harriet Tubman's impact on her community was undeniable. Her efforts to care for the elderly and orphaned, to fight for racial justice, and to provide for those in need ensured that her legacy lived on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of those whose lives she touched. Harriet's work in these later years may have been quieter than her earlier acts of resistance, but it was no less powerful. It was in these final years, surrounded by those she had helped, that Harriet's full legacy took shape, not just as a freedom fighter, but as a compassionate leader who continued to fight for justice and equality until the very end. Though she passed away in 1913, Harriet Tubman's impact on the world endures. Her commitment to helping those in need, even in the face of her own struggles, remains an example of what it means to live a life dedicated to service, compassion, and justice. Her work with the elderly, the orphaned, and the marginalized communities she fought for in her later years is just as important as her role in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman's life is a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the belief that even the most difficult circumstances can be overcome with courage and compassion. Harriet Tubman's life came to a peaceful close on March 10, 1913, at the age of 93. The world that she had helped change, the world that had been transformed by her courage, resilience, and undying commitment to justice, was a very different place than the one into which she was born. Harriet passed away in her home in Auburn, New York, surrounded by loved ones. and as she left this world, the legacy she had crafted through decades of struggle continued to resonate throughout the United States and beyond. In the years following her death, Harriet's contributions to the abolition of slavery and the fight for freedom and equality would become more widely recognized. During her lifetime, her work had often been overlooked or undervalued, but after her passing, her incredible achievements began to receive the attention they deserved. Harriet's involvement in the Underground Railroad, her service as a spy and nurse during the Civil War, and her later advocacy for civil rights and women's suffrage made her one of the most significant figures in American history. But Harriet's legacy was not simply defined by her activism and the causes she championed. It was also defined by her deep humanity, her selflessness, and her tireless efforts to ensure the well-being of others. In her later years, Harriet had been deeply involved in providing for the elderly and orphaned, ensuring that those most in need had a place to turn. Even as she struggled with her own health and financial difficulties, Harriet never stopped caring for the people around her, demonstrating time and again that her life's work was not just about fighting for freedom, it was about helping others find hope, dignity, and purpose. In the years after Harriet's passing, many began to recognize the extraordinary life she'd lived and the profound impact she'd made on the lives of those she had touched. Statues were erected in her honor, and her story began to be told in schools and public forums across the country. Harriet Tubman's name became synonymous with courage, bravery, and the unyielding pursuit of justice, and her legacy became a source of inspiration for countless individuals fighting for freedom and equality. Harriet's passing also served as a reminder of the importance of remembering the contributions of those who came before us, especially those whose efforts were often overlooked or forgotten. In the early 20th century, the country was undergoing significant social and political changes, with the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement gaining momentum. Harriet's legacy, particularly her work for the rights of women and African Americans, helped lay the foundation for these movements, and her life's work would continue to inspire the activists and leaders who would carry her torch into the future. Though Harriet Tubman's passing marked the end of an era, her influence did not fade with her death. The nation she had helped transform was still grappling with issues of racial inequality, gender discrimination, and the struggle for civil rights. But Harriet's example provided a beacon of hope. She had shown that one person, driven by love and justice, could change the world. Her work, carried out in the face of tremendous danger and adversity, proved that the fight for freedom and equality was worth every sacrifice. In the years following her death, Harriet Tubman was honored by a growing number of institutions and organizations. She became the subject of numerous books, articles, and speeches that celebrated her courage and selflessness. The story of her life was shared with future generations, who found in her example a source of inspiration for their own struggles for justice. Her memory was kept alive not only in historical accounts, but in the hearts of the people whose lives had been touched by her bravery. Harriet Tubman's lasting impact is seen today in the continued fight for civil rights and equality. She is remembered as one of the most important figures in American history, and her legacy continues to shape movements for social justice. Her unwavering commitment to freedom, her tireless efforts to end slavery, and her role in securing the rights of women and African Americans left an indelible mark on the history of the United States. As the years passed, Harriet Tubman's name became a symbol of hope, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. She is remembered not just for her work on the Underground Railroad or her service during the Civil War, but for the way she lived her life, steadfast in her commitment to fight for the freedom of others, even when it meant risking her own life. Harriet's life reminds us that true greatness is not defined by fame or wealth, but by the ability to make a difference in the lives of others, to stand up for what is right, and to fight for the dignity and freedom of all people. In the years following Harriet Tubman's death in 1913, her legacy continued to grow, though the recognition she received during her lifetime had been minimal. After her passing, however, the impact of her incredible contributions to the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad, and the Civil War began to be more widely acknowledged, particularly as the country faced the challenges of the early 20th century. During the 1910s and 1920s, Harriet's name began to be more widely celebrated, and her story was recognized as a powerful example of courage, resilience, and selflessness. Her legacy became especially relevant during a time when both the women's suffrage movement and the growing momentum for civil rights were challenging the structures of inequality that had defined American society for centuries. Harriet's life was a symbol of the progress that had been made, but also a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. Her story inspired a new generation of activists, particularly those focused on racial justice, equality, and women's rights. One of the first major recognitions of Harriet Tubman's legacy came in 1914, the year after her death, when her memorial service was held in Washington, D.C. The service brought together abolitionists, civil rights leaders, and women's suffrage activists, all of whom recognized Harriet as a pioneering figure in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. The ceremony was an opportunity to reflect on her immense contributions and the significant impact she had on the fight for freedom and equality. Though Harriet had never sought fame or public recognition for her work, her legacy gradually gained the recognition it deserved. The need for figures like Harriet, who'd worked on the ground level to change the lives of so many, was becoming more apparent as the civil rights movement gained traction in the early 20th century. The work she'd done, often under the radar, was now seen as essential to the broader cause of freedom and human rights. In this period of growing social and political movements, Harriet Tubman's name became synonymous with hope, resistance, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Throughout the 1920s, several important honors were bestowed upon Harriet's memory. In 1921, the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, presented a tribute to Harriet, acknowledging her lifelong commitment to freedom and justice. The NACW, which had been a powerful organization in advocating for the rights of African American women, honored Harriet as one of the leading figures in the struggle for equality. Her legacy as both a freedom fighter and an advocate for women's rights had become inextricably linked with the larger fight for civil rights. In addition to these tributes, there were also calls for a more formal recognition of Harriet's contributions. In 1925, a bill was introduced in Congress to provide Harriet Tubman with a pension for her service as a nurse and scout during the Civil War. The bill sought to right the wrongs of her lifetime, where she'd been overlooked and undercompensated for her tireless work. However, despite strong support from both the African American community and some sympathetic lawmakers, the bill did not pass. Nevertheless, these efforts to honor her legacy were part of a larger movement to ensure that the contributions of African Americans, particularly women, were acknowledged and celebrated. By the late 1920s, the recognition of Harriet Tubman's legacy had grown to include a wider range of public institutions. Several schools, organizations, and even towns were named in her honor, and her story was becoming more widely taught in schools across the country. Harriet's courage and contributions were increasingly seen as pivotal moments in American history, and her role in the abolition of slavery, as well as her fight for women's rights, was being woven into the larger narrative of the American struggle for freedom and equality. However, it wasn't just formal recognition that marked the ongoing celebration of Harriet Tubman's legacy. In the hearts and minds of the people who had long been fighting for justice, Harriet remained a symbol of what could be achieved when one person stood firm in their belief in the possibility of a better world. Her story, told through the generations, continued to inspire countless individuals who would pick up the baton of civil rights, fighting for a world where justice and equality were not just ideals, but realities. The official recognition of Harriet Tubman's legacy did not come without challenges, and it would take decades before she received the full acknowledgement she deserved. But the efforts made in the 1920s laid the groundwork for the later recognition she would receive. Her name and the stories of her bravery would continue to echo through history, as each new generation discovered the incredible life of a woman who had fought so fiercely for freedom and equality. By the time of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s, Harriet Tubman had become a symbol of both the struggle and the triumph of the fight for justice. Her story was used by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who invoked her example of resistance and courage in the ongoing fight for equality. Her name was now seen alongside other great figures of the abolitionist movement and the civil rights era as one of the most important heroes in American history. As the civil rights movement gathered momentum in the mid-20th century, Harriet Tubman's legacy became an enduring symbol of resistance and hope for Black Americans fighting for equality. Though she had passed decades earlier, her story, like the stories of so many heroes of the abolitionist movement, served as a foundation for the struggle for civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s. Her role in the abolition of slavery, her work on the Underground Railroad, and her dedication to the cause of freedom continued to inspire generations of activists who carried her torch in the fight for racial justice. During this period, the legacy of Harriet Tubman was invoked by many of the movement's leaders who drew strength from her example. One of the most influential figures of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., often cited Harriet Tubman as a symbol of courage and determination. Her actions, as both a freedom fighter and a leader, resonated deeply with those fighting for equality during the turbulent years of the 1950s and 1960s. Her name became synonymous with resistance to injustice, and activists saw in her a model of the kind of leadership needed to fight against the systems of segregation and racial oppression that still existed in the United States. Tubman's courage in the face of overwhelming odds, her ability to lead others toward freedom, and her relentless pursuit of justice served as an inspiration for a new generation of leaders in the civil rights movement. Harriet's story was particularly relevant as the movement sought to address the injustices that persisted in the South, where segregation and discrimination were still entrenched. The struggle for freedom and equality was not just a historical fight, it was one that continued to play out in the daily lives of African Americans. Tubman's legacy was deeply connected to the fight against the systematic violence and oppression that many African Americans still endured. Her name, evoked in speeches and sermons, reminded activists that the fight for civil rights was not a new struggle, but one that had been fought by countless generations before them. Her example was also invoked in the struggle for women's rights. Tubman's advocacy for women's suffrage, though often overshadowed by her abolitionist work, became more prominent in the 1960s as the feminist movement gained momentum. Harriet's unwavering belief in the need for both racial and gender equality made her a fitting icon for the women's liberation movement, which was calling for equal rights for women, particularly in the areas of voting, employment, and education. Harriet Tubman's commitment to helping others, regardless of the cost to herself, became a central tenet of the civil rights movement. She was celebrated not only for her work in freeing enslaved people, but also for her tireless efforts to help improve the lives of those who had already been freed, but still faced oppressive systems of racism. Her life was a testament to the power of one individual to change the course of history, and her legacy helped inspire those who sought to transform the nation in the 1950s and 1960s. Her story also provided a powerful reminder of the intersectionality of oppression. Harriet's life was shaped not only by her race, but also by her gender. She understood that the fight for freedom and equality could not be won without addressing both racial and gender-based injustices. Her advocacy for women's suffrage was an important aspect of her legacy, as it reinforced the idea that women, black and white alike, deserved to have their voices heard in the fight for justice. This connection between the fight for racial and gender equality would be a driving force in the civil rights and feminist movements of the 20th century. As the civil rights movement reached its peak in the 1960s, Harriet Tubman's legacy continued to live on in the hearts of the people who carried on her fight. Her story was passed down from one generation to the next, becoming an integral part of the narrative of the struggle for equality. In addition to her influence on the civil rights leaders of the time, Harriet Tubman's legacy resonated in the arts, where her story inspired poets, musicians, and artists who sought to capture the strength and resilience that defined her life. Throughout the civil rights era, Tubman's example was used as a symbol of the transformative power of resistance. Her ability to act in the face of danger, her unshakable belief in the value of every human life, and her refusal to accept the status quo served as an inspiration for those who risk their own lives in the name of justice. As the movement progressed and victories were won, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Harriet Tubman's life remained a guiding light for those who fought for justice. She was more than just a historical figure. She was a symbol of the power of individual action to create lasting change. Her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad and her role in the fight for freedom became an integral part of the ongoing narrative of the African American struggle for equality. In the years following her death, Harriet Tubman's life was celebrated in a variety of ways. Schools, monuments, and public institutions were named in her honor, ensuring that future generations would know her story. Her legacy became an enduring part of the broader history of the United States, as her fight for freedom and equality continued to inspire those who believed in the power of resistance and the possibility of change. In the latter years of her life, Harriet Tubman remained steadfast in her belief that education was essential to the freedom and empowerment of African Americans. Although she had not been formally educated as a child, her personal experiences and her role in liberating countless individuals taught her that knowledge was a critical tool in the struggle for true equality. Harriet's work for the education of black people, especially in the years following the Civil War, was driven by her deep understanding that freedom extended beyond the abolition of slavery. True freedom, she believed, required access to education, the key to personal and collective empowerment. In the 1880s and 1890s, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, many formerly enslaved individuals were left with little more than their freedom. With little to no formal schooling during slavery, most of these men and women were uneducated and illiterate, which severely limited their ability to gain independence and prosper in the new social order. Harriet Tubman understood this reality and worked to ensure that education, especially for African Americans, became a central part of the post-war rebuilding process. Harriet's advocacy for education was rooted in her belief that it was the foundation of freedom, and that learning could dismantle the systemic oppression that had been built on ignorance and prejudice. She herself had been denied an education as a child, so she knew firsthand the obstacles that could be overcome with the right tools and knowledge. Harriet understood that education was not just a way to learn how to read or write. It was a way to gain the power to make informed decisions and to rise above the limitations of race and class that had previously confined black people. After the war, Harriet continued to be involved in various educational initiatives, particularly those aimed at providing opportunities for black children. She worked with local schools and organizations to help establish educational programs for freed slaves and their children. Though Harriet was not a formal educator, she recognized the importance of literacy and skill building in the struggle for full civil rights. She often visited schools in the area, speaking to children about the importance of education, hard work, and perseverance. Her own life story, marked by resilience and a commitment to personal growth, made her a powerful advocate for the transformative power of learning. In addition to her work with children, Harriet Tubman also played a role in advocating for adult education. Many formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom in the years after the Civil War had no formal education, and Harriet understood that this lack of literacy severely limited their ability to improve their lives. She worked to raise awareness about the importance of adult education and supported local efforts to establish night schools and other educational programs for adults. Harriet believed that no one, regardless of their age or background, should be denied the opportunity to learn, and she advocated for programs that would help all people gain the knowledge they needed to build better lives. Harriet's own commitment to lifelong learning was evident in the way she continued to educate herself and seek new knowledge throughout her life. Though she did not have formal schooling, she was a lifelong learner, constantly reading and seeking to understand the world around her. She took pride in learning from others and was always open to new ideas and perspectives. In many ways, Harriet's commitment to learning was as strong as her commitment to freedom, as she understood that knowledge was a powerful weapon in the fight against oppression. Despite her struggles with poverty and health, Harriet Tubman remained a tireless advocate for the education of African Americans throughout her later years. She recognized that the success of the black community depended not only on the right to vote or the abolition of slavery, but also on the ability to access the tools that would allow individuals to thrive and succeed. Harriet's commitment to the cause of education extended beyond the classroom. She believed that education was a tool of resistance and empowerment, allowing people to challenge the systems of inequality and injustice that had held them back for so long. Harriet also understood the importance of educating black women. Throughout her life, she saw the ways in which race and gender combined to create additional barriers for African American women. She was determined to ensure that black women, like their male counterparts, had access to the education they needed to build their own futures. Harriet's advocacy for women's suffrage was part of this broader belief in the importance of women's education. She saw the fight for women's rights as closely connected to the fight for racial equality in education, believing that black women deserved not only the right to vote, but also the ability to access the education and resources that would allow them to fully participate in society. Though Harriet's health had declined by the early 1900s, her work and advocacy for education remained a central part of her life's mission. She never lost sight of her ultimate goal, to see the black community thrive and achieve its full potential. Harriet continued to work, speak, and advocate for education and the rights of black people, knowing that true freedom could not be achieved without access to knowledge and opportunity. Harriet Tubman's impact on the fight for education did not end with her death in 1913. In the years that followed, her legacy continued to inspire those who believed in the power of education to transform lives. Her story of struggle, perseverance, and triumph in the face of adversity was a beacon of hope for generations to come. Harriet's life and work were an embodiment of the belief that education is a key to empowerment, and her contributions to the cause of educational equality remain a powerful part of her enduring legacy. In the years following Harriet Tubman's death in 1913, the nation continued to grapple with the deep-seated injustices that had persisted even after the Civil War. The abolition of slavery had ended one form of oppression, but many African Americans, especially in the South, still faced extreme discrimination, disenfranchisement, and poverty. Although Harriet Tubman had played a pivotal role in the liberation of hundreds of enslaved people and had contributed significantly to the Union Army during the Civil War, she found little recognition or compensation for her efforts during her lifetime, and that continued after her death. For many years, Tubman's contributions were largely overlooked by the very society she had fought to free. Though she had risked her life time and time again to bring people to safety, Harriet was denied the pension that many of her fellow Union soldiers received. Despite her service as a nurse, cook, and spy during the war, Tubman's attempts to receive compensation were repeatedly denied, and it wasn't until years after her death that her sacrifices were acknowledged. Harriet's struggle to receive a government pension exemplified the broader pattern of systemic disregard for the contributions of African Americans in American history. While many of her white counterparts were compensated for their service, Tubman faced the added hurdle of both racial and gender prejudice. These obstacles made it difficult for Harriet to receive the recognition she deserved, and her struggle to receive even a modest pension was a reflection of the larger racial and gender inequality of the time. It wasn't until 1899, nearly 30 years after her service, that Tubman was finally awarded a government pension. This pension, however, was not given to her for her invaluable work as a spy and a nurse during the Civil War, but rather as a recognition for her work as a veteran. Even so, Harriet's financial struggles did not immediately end, as the pension was far less than she had earned through her service. And while her life's work was gaining more recognition, the compensation did not adequately reflect the immense sacrifices she had made. Despite this injustice, Tubman's work continued to influence and inspire new generations. While her death in 1913 was mourned by many, her legacy lived on in the stories that began to surface in the decades following her passing. Her life as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, her contributions to the Union cause, and her tireless fight for equality became central to discussions about American history. Yet the official recognition that she so richly deserved was still slow to come. Harriet's posthumous recognition began to shift with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and other prominent figures in the movement often referred to Harriet Tubman as a source of inspiration. She was invoked not only as a symbol of the struggle for racial equality, but also as a symbol of resilience in the face of oppression. Her name became synonymous with resistance to injustice and a model for how one individual could make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming odds. While Harriet's legacy was embraced by many, it is important to acknowledge the continued struggle for African American recognition, which had been part of the larger history of racial discrimination. Tubman's story stood as a powerful reminder that the fight for civil rights was ongoing, and that the work of freedom fighters like her was not just to be remembered but acted upon. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained more visibility, Harriet was hailed not just as an historical figure, but as a symbol of hope for the future, a figure whose perseverance was a call to action for those still facing the effects of racial inequality. However, even as the nation began to pay tribute to her accomplishments, the recognition that Harriet received was often limited to rhetoric. The systemic injustices that had prevented her from receiving her due recognition during her lifetime were deeply ingrained, and the acknowledgement of her contributions was still frequently limited to symbolic gestures rather than concrete reparations or institutional support. For much of the early 20th century, the government and historical institutions continued to fail in offering tangible acknowledgement of her sacrifices, as they had failed to do so in the years after her service. Despite the inequities she faced, Harriet Tubman's story became a rallying cry for social justice movements, not just in the United States but around the world. In the 1920s, as new waves of civil rights and feminist movements began to rise, her name was invoked by leaders seeking to change the social and political structures that oppressed African Americans and women. Tubman's struggle for freedom, her commitment to ensuring that others were able to enjoy the liberty that was denied to her for so long, became the foundation of many movements that sought equality. Tubman's legacy, built on her unflinching courage, the lives she saved, and her enduring belief in the possibility of a better world, gradually became a source of inspiration for new generations. Her name became increasingly associated with civil rights activism and gender equality. Though her struggle for formal recognition was marred by the racial and gender biases of her time, the power of her life's work was undeniable, and the future of activism in the 20th century was shaped in part by the sacrifices she made during her lifetime. Though Harriet Tubman passed away in 1913, her legacy has grown exponentially over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, as her life story has been increasingly honoured, remembered, and celebrated. The recognition of her contributions, once delayed and undervalued, has evolved into an enduring tribute to her extraordinary work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, her service in the Civil War, and her lifelong commitment to freedom and equality for African Americans and women. Today, her name is synonymous with courage, resilience, and an unwavering dedication to justice. One of the earliest memorials to Harriet Tubman came just a few years after her death. In 1914, a memorial service was held in her honor in Washington, D.C. The event was attended by a mix of abolitionists, suffragists, and civil rights leaders who celebrated her extraordinary life. This was one of the first significant public recognitions of her achievements, and it provided the opportunity for many to reflect on her pivotal role in the abolition of slavery and her later efforts in the fight for civil rights. Though Tubman did not live to see such ceremonies, the recognition was an important moment in beginning to publicly honor her contributions. In the following decades, Tubman's legacy would begin to take root more deeply in the broader national consciousness. The 1920s saw increased focus on women's suffrage as the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. Harriet Tubman, with her dual legacy as both an abolitionist and suffragist, was increasingly invoked as a pioneering figure in the fight for equal rights. Her life became a rallying cry for civil rights and women's rights activists alike, and she was held up as an example of the courage and perseverance necessary for systemic change. In the 1940s, as World War II raged on, Harriet's role in the Civil War and her involvement in the abolitionist movement was revisited by both historians and civil rights leaders. The African American community, fighting for equal rights during the early stages of the civil rights movement, found inspiration in her life. She was hailed as one of the leading figures in the struggle for equality and justice, and her example became especially relevant in the context of the global fight against fascism, racism, and oppression. The official recognition of Harriet Tubman's legacy continued to gain momentum as the civil rights movement reached its peak in the 1960s. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. frequently referenced Tubman's courageous acts and selfless sacrifices when speaking to audiences about the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Harriet was invoked as a symbol of hope for future generations, reminding those involved in the movement that the fight for freedom and equality had a long and storied history. Tubman's story also served as a poignant reminder that the struggle was far from over, and that each generation had a role to play in continuing the work she had started. In the decades that followed, Harriet Tubman's name became associated with countless memorials and public tributes across the country. Schools, libraries, and statues were dedicated to her memory, and her life story was taught in schools as part of the broader history of the abolitionist movement and the struggle for civil rights. In 1990, a national monument was proposed to honor Tubman in the form of the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York, which includes her home and the surrounding areas where she spent much of her later years. The establishment of the park was part of a broader effort to ensure that her contributions were preserved for future generations. Harriet Tubman's legacy was further cemented when, in the 21st century, calls grew for her to be featured on the U.S. $20 bill. In 2016, Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew announced that Harriet Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson as the face of the $20 note, making her the first woman and the first African American to be featured on U.S. currency. The announcement was met with widespread acclaim, as it was seen as a long overdue recognition of Tubman's extraordinary contributions to American history. Her face on the $20 bill serves as a powerful symbol of her legacy, as one of the most transformative figures in the history of the United States. In addition to the currency change, there were numerous cultural and academic efforts to honor Tubman's life. Her story became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, films, and theatrical productions, all of which sought to capture the full scope of her bravery, intelligence, and leadership. Her role as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, rescuing over 70 enslaved individuals, was often highlighted, but her wartime contributions and her later advocacy for civil rights and women's suffrage also received increasing attention. While recognition of Harriet Tubman's legacy in the public sphere has grown, it is important to remember that her story is still evolving. The recognition of her contributions is not just about honoring her historical role, but about learning from her example. Harriet Tubman's life teaches us that resistance is possible, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that individuals can have a profound impact on the world, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the present day, Harriet Tubman's legacy continues to inspire and resonate with people fighting for justice, equality, and freedom around the world. Her name remains a touchstone for activists, educators, and policymakers who seek to honor her commitment to civil rights. As we reflect on her extraordinary life and the changes she helped to bring about, Harriet Tubman's influence can be seen in the ongoing struggles for racial and gender equality. Her legacy lives on, not only in the monuments and tributes that bear her name, but in the hearts and minds of all who are inspired by her courage and her enduring vision for a better, more just world. Harriet Tubman's legacy continues to be a profound influence on modern activism, inspiring movements for racial justice, gender equality, and human rights across the globe. In the 21st century, her story remains a beacon of hope for those who fight against oppression and inequality, serving as a reminder that one person's courage can indeed change the course of history. Tubman's life of relentless resistance, personal sacrifice, and advocacy for freedom continues to inspire activists, educators, and leaders in their efforts to dismantle systems of injustice and create a more equitable world. Her contributions to the abolition of slavery, her work as a nurse and spy during the Civil War, and her tireless advocacy for women's suffrage are still cited as examples of profound leadership in the face of adversity. But beyond her historical role, Harriet Tubman's life offers timeless lessons on the nature of resistance and the power of individual action. Her legacy has become a critical part of modern struggles for racial equality, particularly in the context of the ongoing fight against systemic racism. In the 21st century, as issues of police brutality, mass incarceration, and racial injustice continue to make headlines, Harriet Tubman's story is often invoked as a symbol of the ongoing fight for Black liberation. Her life is an inspiration to those who are part of the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups advocating for racial justice. Tubman's ability to challenge the status quo, despite the immense risks she faced, provides a model for modern activists working to resist the oppression faced by Black Americans and other marginalized communities. Her courage and determination has been woven into the fabric of contemporary struggles for racial equity. Her name is invoked by contemporary activists and leaders who fight for social justice, from the streets of Ferguson to the halls of Congress. Tubman's story is also vital in discussions about the need for criminal justice reform, as her own work to help free individuals from slavery parallels efforts to dismantle systems that keep marginalized people in cycles of incarceration. Her legacy serves as a reminder that the struggle for justice is ongoing, and that the road to true freedom requires relentless dedication to dismantling systems of oppression. Additionally, Tubman's impact can be seen in modern feminist movements. Her advocacy for women's rights, especially her belief that the struggle for women's suffrage was interconnected with the abolition of slavery, remains relevant today. Tubman's work reminds modern feminists of the importance of intersectionality, the understanding that different forms of oppression, including racism and sexism, are intertwined and must be confronted together. The feminist movement, particularly in its fight for reproductive rights, equal pay, and protection from gender-based violence, continues to be inspired by Tubman's activism and her insistence that freedom for women cannot be achieved without fighting for racial justice at the same time. One of the most significant ways Harriet Tubman's legacy is celebrated in the 21st century is through education and public commemoration. Schools, museums, and cultural centres dedicated to Tubman's life and work have been established to teach her story to new generations. Tubman's inclusion in educational curricula has become a way to introduce young people to the importance of resistance, courage, and the power of individual action in the face of systemic injustice. Her life is studied as a critical part of American history, offering valuable lessons about the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, and the ongoing fight for civil rights. Harriet Tubman's example has also shaped the way that many contemporary activists view the role of women in movements for social change. While she is celebrated for her role in the fight for black freedom, Tubman's legacy has also helped to emphasize the role of women in leadership positions in activism. Her life demonstrates that women have always been and continue to be essential to movements for change. This lesson is particularly evident in the 21st century, where women have played a prominent role in movements like #MeToo and Black Lives Matter. Harriet Tubman's legacy as a leader who took risks for the sake of others and fought tirelessly for justice is seen as an example for today's women fighting for social justice across a variety of issues. In addition to her work in the Civil War and on the Underground Railroad, Tubman's later years, as she continued to fight for racial justice and civil rights, resonate in today's struggles for economic justice. Her commitment to helping marginalized communities, particularly women and children, aligns with modern efforts to create fairer, more just societies. As Tubman worked to establish a home for the elderly and advocated for the welfare of formerly enslaved people, today's social welfare activists continue to fight for equitable access to housing, health care, and opportunities for those most impacted by poverty and inequality. Tubman's legacy also resonates with modern environmental justice movements. Just as Harriet Tubman freed individuals from the physical and mental chains of slavery, today's environmental justice activists fight against the systemic oppression caused by environmental degradation, which disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. Tubman's legacy of liberation, her fight against systems of control, and her belief in the dignity of every human being serve as an inspiration for those working to combat environmental racism and fight for sustainable, equitable solutions to global crises. Finally, Harriet Tubman's enduring legacy has led to growing calls for public memorials to honor her. In addition to the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York, where her home and life are commemorated, there are increasing efforts to install statues and monuments in her honor across the United States. These memorials ensure that her contributions are not forgotten, offering lasting reminders of her bravery and unshakable commitment to freedom. The recent push to feature Harriet Tubman on the U.S. $20 bill symbolizes a collective recognition of her contributions, ensuring that her story is remembered as a central part of American history. Harriet Tubman's legacy has been immortalized not only in historical records and memorials, but also in popular culture, where her story continues to inspire, educate, and provoke important conversations about freedom, equality, and justice. From books to films, theatre productions to songs, Tubman's life has become a symbol of courage, resilience, and resistance. Through these depictions, her contributions to the abolitionist movement, her work on the Underground Railroad, and her service in the Civil War have been shared with millions of people worldwide, ensuring that her legacy endures for generations to come. One of the earliest popular depictions of Harriet Tubman came in the form of literature. Tubman's own autobiography, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, published in 1869, was one of the first accounts of her life. Written by Sarah Bradford, the book was instrumental in spreading Tubman's story to the public. While it did not achieve widespread acclaim during Tubman's lifetime, it laid the foundation for later literary works about her. Over time, her story was retold in books, articles, and biographies, some of which painted her as a hero, and others as a complex and deeply human figure. Each new retelling kept her story alive and relevant, offering fresh perspectives on her life and legacy. In the 20th century, Harriet Tubman began to gain more prominent recognition in the arts, particularly as a symbol of strength and resistance. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, her story took on new significance as activists drew connections between Tubman's work and the ongoing struggles for black freedom and equality. Artists and writers began to embrace Tubman as a symbol of black empowerment and resistance, linking her story to the broader narrative of the African American fight for civil rights. In literature, Tubman's story was further expanded upon by writers like Jubilee author Margaret Walker, who delved into the personal and emotional aspects of Tubman's experiences as both a slave and a freedom fighter. In Harriet Tubman, Conductor on the Underground Railroad by Ann Petrie, one of the most famous novels about her life, the book presents Tubman as a heroic figure who overcame incredible odds to lead enslaved people to freedom. The novel, along with others, reinforced Tubman's position as an icon in the fight against oppression. The arts also played a pivotal role in keeping Harriet Tubman's legacy alive. Theatre productions, including one by the American Negro Theatre in the 1940s, and later adaptations, used the stage to celebrate her remarkable life. Through theatre, Tubman's story was shared with audiences who may not have otherwise encountered it, and her work in the abolitionist movement became a cultural touchstone. Tubman became a figure to be admired, one whose story was integral to the national consciousness. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Harriet Tubman was frequently portrayed in films and documentaries. While these depictions have varied in their approach and accuracy, they have consistently portrayed her as a determined and courageous leader. In 1978, the made-for-TV film Harriet Tubman, Conductor on the Underground Railroad, starred actress Cicely Tyson, a portrayal that remains one of the most celebrated and respected representations of Tubman. Tyson's performance captured the depth of Tubman's character, portraying both her fierce determination and her deep humanity. This film, along with others that followed, played a crucial role in introducing Harriet Tubman's story to a broader audience and cementing her place in popular culture. The 21st century has seen a resurgence in the telling of Harriet Tubman's story. In recent years, Tubman has been portrayed by several actresses, including Cynthia Erivo in the 2019 film Harriet, which was released to critical acclaim. Erivo's powerful portrayal of Tubman in this biographical drama reintroduced the abolitionist leader to a new generation and drew attention to her unyielding bravery. The film focuses on her leadership in the Underground Railroad, as well as the profound emotional and psychological impact of her work. It reaffirms Harriet Tubman's place in American history as one of the country's greatest heroes, underscoring the emotional and moral weight of her actions. The modern cultural renaissance of Harriet Tubman's legacy is not limited to film and television. Tubman's image has been prominently featured in public art installations, including murals and sculptures, all of which celebrate her contributions to the abolition of slavery and the advancement of racial and gender equality. In Washington, D.C., a bronze statue of Tubman was unveiled in 2016, adding her to the list of other famous figures in the National Statuary Hall collection. Tubman's image has also appeared on stamps and has been incorporated into the fabric of institutions dedicated to advancing civil rights, including the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The push for Harriet Tubman's face to appear on U.S. currency, specifically on the $20 bill, was a significant milestone in recognizing her importance in American history. The announcement in 2016 that Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 note was met with widespread praise and celebration. It was an important step in acknowledging not only her role in the abolition of slavery, but also the broader history of African American contributions to the country. Although there have been delays in issuing the new bill, the very fact that Tubman was chosen to be immortalized in this way speaks to the lasting power of her story and the public recognition of her legacy. Harriet Tubman's portrayal in popular culture is also marked by the way her story has been adapted to fit contemporary social issues. As activists continue to challenge racial inequality, Tubman's life and work are often used as an inspiration for movements that focus on dismantling systems of oppression. Her legacy of leading individuals to freedom is a metaphor for today's ongoing struggle for racial justice, economic equality, and the dismantling of institutionalized racism. In literature, theatre, film, and the arts, Harriet Tubman remains a figure whose story resonates deeply with modern audiences. Her legacy is celebrated not only for her bravery in the face of adversity, but also for the transformative power of resistance, activism, and selfless leadership. In popular culture, Harriet Tubman is no longer just a historical figure. She's a symbol of the fight for freedom, equality, and human dignity. As new generations discover her life's work, Harriet Tubman's story continues to inspire people across the world, motivating them to work toward a more just and equitable future. As the 21st century progresses, Harriet Tubman's legacy continues to resonate deeply with those fighting for social justice, equality, and the eradication of systemic oppression. Her life story, marked by selfless dedication to the cause of freedom, is more relevant today than ever before. The ongoing struggle for racial justice, gender equality, and economic fairness in the United States and around the world draws inspiration from the work and life of Harriet Tubman, a woman who fought not only for her own freedom, but for the freedom of hundreds of others. In recent years, as movements like Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, and various economic justice campaigns have gained momentum, Tubman's life and actions have become a source of inspiration for modern-day activists. Her commitment to fighting oppression, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, serves as a model for the work still left to do in the areas of racial and gender equality. Tubman's courage in the face of personal danger and her determination to see others freed from the chains of systemic injustice are qualities that continue to inspire and guide the work of those advocating for justice in the present day. The Black Lives Matter movement, which seeks to address the issues of police violence, mass incarceration, and systemic racism, often invokes Tubman's legacy as a symbol of resistance. Her determination to fight for freedom, even at the risk of her own life, mirrors the activism of today's young leaders who are calling for an end to the brutal treatment of black people by law enforcement. Harriet Tubman's ability to navigate the dangerous, oppressive system of slavery and lead others to freedom parallels the work of modern activists who are navigating a system that continues to oppress people of color. For these modern leaders, Tubman is not just a historical figure, but a guide, someone whose life's work demonstrates that liberation is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Tubman's legacy also plays an important role in contemporary movements for gender equality, particularly in terms of the intersectionality of race and gender. Her efforts to fight for both the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage continue to be a point of inspiration for modern feminists. Tubman's belief that the liberation of women could not be separated from the liberation of black people was a foundational idea for contemporary feminist movements that emphasized the importance of addressing multiple forms of oppression at the same time. Her example of leadership, which broke gender norms and defied racial barriers, continues to inspire women around the world to fight for their rights, not only as women but as individuals deserving of equality and freedom from oppression. Her advocacy for the rights of women of color has become increasingly relevant in a world where the intersections of race, class, and gender continue to define many of the struggles facing marginalized communities. The feminist movement in the 21st century, particularly the rise of intersectional feminism, draws on Tubman's example. Her activism, first as an enslaved woman and later as a leader in the fight for equal rights, reminds contemporary activists that the fight for gender equality cannot be separated from the fight for racial justice. Furthermore, Tubman's work continues to be a rallying cry for movements advocating for economic justice. Her leadership in helping free enslaved people is often tied to the broader struggle for economic equality, especially for those in oppressed communities. The work that Tubman did in assisting formerly enslaved people in gaining their freedom can be seen as part of the larger movement for economic justice that seeks to provide opportunities for Black Americans and other marginalized groups to access wealth and security. Tubman's legacy is a reminder that the fight for equality is not just about political rights, but about economic empowerment as well. Tubman's influence can also be felt in the global movement for human rights. As a symbol of resistance to oppression and a champion for the dignity of all people, her life resonates with those around the world who are fighting against injustice. From refugees fleeing violence to oppressed groups seeking recognition and rights, Tubman's story serves as an enduring reminder of the importance of freedom and dignity for all people. Her legacy inspires individuals across the world who are challenging systems of tyranny, discrimination, and oppression, and who are working to create more just and equitable societies. Her influence has also extended to education, where her story is used to inspire and teach new generations of activists, leaders, and students. Tubman's life is studied not only for its historical importance, but also for its lessons in leadership, resilience, and social responsibility. She is featured in educational curricula and taught as a pivotal figure in the abolitionist movement, as well as in discussions about civil rights and social justice. Her life provides a critical example of how ordinary individuals can become extraordinary leaders and effect lasting change in the face of profound adversity. In recognition of her legacy, a variety of commemorations have taken place, from schools, streets, and libraries named in her honor, to the 2016 announcement that Harriet Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. This historic decision was a significant step in recognizing Tubman's place in American history, ensuring that future generations would know the name of a woman who had fought not only for her own freedom, but for the freedom of many. The move to feature her on the currency was a long-awaited acknowledgement of her contributions and the significance of her work in shaping the nation. Harriet Tubman's continued presence in the public consciousness serves as a testament to the enduring power of her legacy. Her story is a source of inspiration to those fighting for justice in all forms and serves as a reminder that the struggle for equality is ongoing. Harriet Tubman's name will continue to be invoked by future generations, as her example of courage and resistance resonates through the ages. Her commitment to freedom, her belief in the inherent dignity of all people, and her tireless work to make the world a better place will never be forgotten. As we move further into the 21st century, Harriet Tubman's legacy is not only cemented in American history, but has become a beacon of hope and inspiration for global movements striving for justice, equality, and human rights. The universal themes of freedom, courage, and resistance that defined her life resonate beyond national borders, influencing people and movements around the world. Tubman's story is shared and honored internationally, not just as a historical narrative, but as a living legacy that continues to inspire those fighting oppression, no matter where it exists. One of the most significant markers of Tubman's global recognition came with the growing international awareness of the struggles for freedom and human dignity. As Tubman's life was celebrated and examined by historians, scholars, and activists, her story began to transcend American borders. Her courage in the face of extreme adversity, her role in the abolition of slavery, and her unwavering commitment to human dignity and justice made her a symbol of resistance that resonated across the globe. As movements for racial justice, gender equality, and refugee rights have gained momentum in countries around the world, Tubman's story has been invoked as a symbol of the fight against systemic oppression. Her role in the Underground Railroad is particularly significant as it represents the power of individuals to fight against institutionalized systems of slavery, a theme that resonates with today's global struggles against human trafficking, modern-day slavery and forced labor. Tubman's ability to guide enslaved individuals toward freedom, using her intelligence, resilience, and strategic thinking, is seen as a powerful metaphor for the efforts of contemporary activists working to protect vulnerable populations and dismantle exploitative systems. Her life also serves as a powerful example in the global fight for women's rights. Tubman's activism was deeply rooted in her belief that true freedom could not be achieved without the full participation of women, particularly women of color. Her advocacy for women's suffrage and her insistence on gender equality in the abolitionist movement have made her a symbol for feminist movements worldwide. Tubman's example reminds contemporary activists that the struggles for racial and gender justice are inextricably linked, and that true liberation must be inclusive of all people, regardless of their gender or race. As gender equality movements expand globally, Tubman's life is increasingly seen as an example of what can be achieved when women take leadership roles in social justice movements. From grassroots organizations to international advocacy groups, Tubman's story is used to highlight the transformative power of women's leadership in the fight for equality and justice. Her legacy challenges the notion that resistance to injustice is limited to certain groups or individuals, and reminds us that women, especially women of color, have always been at the forefront of social change. Additionally, Tubman's story has found a place within movements that fight for the rights of refugees and displaced peoples. In a world where millions of individuals continue to flee violence, war, and economic hardship, Tubman's work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad symbolizes the journey toward freedom that many refugees and asylum seekers face today. Tubman's courage in guiding enslaved people to safety across treacherous paths mirrors the dangerous journeys that refugees undertake to find security and hope for a better life. Her legacy continues to serve as a reminder that the fight for freedom is global, and that those who are most vulnerable to exploitation and oppression deserve the same rights to safety and dignity that Tubman fought for. One of the most notable ways that Tubman's legacy has been recognized globally is through the installation of monuments and memorials dedicated to her life and work. While she had few public honors during her lifetime, today there are statues, plaques, and exhibits in cities across the United States and in other parts of the world. These memorials serve as physical reminders of her contributions to history and as points of reflection for people to learn from her example of courage, selflessness, and resistance. Her image is now a symbol of freedom that is proudly displayed not only in places dedicated to the African American struggle for civil rights, but also in sites around the world where people continue to fight for the same values she championed. International institutions such as the United Nations have also incorporated Harriet Tubman's story into their educational efforts. Tubman's contributions to the abolition of slavery and her work in the fight for freedom and human dignity align closely with the United Nations' mission to promote human rights and eradicate discrimination. Tubman's life is used as a tool to teach the importance of freedom and justice, serving as an example of how individual action can inspire collective change. As Tubman's story continues to spread across the globe, her name has been used to promote programs that focus on the education of marginalized communities, from global initiatives aimed at empowering girls and women to programs focused on racial justice. Tubman's legacy is often invoked as a model of the strength, resilience, and determination needed to break free from systems of oppression. Her life reminds activists and educators alike that the pursuit of justice is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for, no matter the obstacles. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Harriet Tubman's global legacy is the way she exemplified the power of ordinary people to effect extraordinary change. She was not a politician or a scholar, but a woman whose determination and selflessness made an indelible impact on the history of the United States and the world. As the world continues to grapple with issues of inequality, racism, and human rights, Tubman's story serves as both an inspiration and a challenge to stand up, speak out, and take action in the face of injustice. Her life remains a testament to the power of resistance, the potential for change, and the belief that each of us has the ability to make a difference. Harriet Tubman's example continues to inspire those who fight for a world that is free from oppression, where all people, regardless of race, gender, or background, can live in dignity and safety. In the 21st century, Harriet Tubman's influence as a leader continues to be felt, especially in the realms of social justice, activism, and leadership. While her time on Earth ended in 1913, her example of courage, determination, and the selfless fight for justice lives on in the leaders and movements that follow in her footsteps. Tubman's unique brand of leadership, characterized by resilience, empathy, and a fierce commitment to the liberation of others, continues to inspire individuals and organizations working for change in today's world. Tubman's leadership style was not defined by traditional forms of power or authority, but by her ability to lead with compassion and vision. As a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she demonstrated the power of quiet, decisive action. Her leadership wasn't based on titles or formal recognition. It was rooted in her deep understanding of human suffering and the urgency of liberation. She led by example, showing that leadership does not always require a grand stage, but rather the willingness to take action and make difficult decisions in the pursuit of a just cause. This principle of leading by action, not by proclamation, resonates with modern leaders who are tackling pressing issues like racial justice, economic inequality, and environmental sustainability. In today's movements for racial justice, Tubman's leadership is celebrated as a model for how to move forward in the face of adversity. Leaders who advocate for systemic change draw on her example of resistance against an oppressive system, while also embodying her commitment to community and collective action. Modern activists, like those involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, continue to echo Tubman's belief in the necessity of direct action. Often operating outside of traditional political structures, Tubman's work with the Underground Railroad demonstrated that systemic injustice can be confronted head-on by individuals and grassroots organizations working together. Her leadership is also evident in movements for gender equality. Tubman's tireless advocacy for women's suffrage in the late 19th century set the stage for the struggles that would later define the feminist movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. Today, Tubman is seen as an icon of intersectional feminism, understanding that the fight for gender equality must also address the racial and class-based injustices that women, particularly women of color, face. Her advocacy for both racial and gender equality continues to inform modern feminist movements that are striving for equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to violence against women. Leaders in the global fight for gender equality cite Tubman as a source of inspiration for her unwavering belief that liberation for all women is not optional, it is essential. Furthermore, Tubman's leadership and activism have shaped the way we think about the role of women in leadership, especially in historically marginalized communities. Tubman's ability to rise above the constraints placed on her by her race, gender, and social status challenges contemporary leaders to think differently about who is qualified to lead and what makes a person an effective leader. Her example inspires women of all backgrounds to take up leadership roles and contribute their voices to the ongoing struggles for justice, equity, and human rights. In the world of political activism, Tubman's commitment to social change continues to inspire individuals who are not just fighting for policy reform, but seeking to fundamentally change the systems that perpetuate inequality. Tubman understood that slavery wasn't just a moral wrong. It was a system that was deeply woven into the fabric of American society, and it would take nothing short of a revolution to dismantle it. Today, political activists fighting for systemic change, whether in the realm of education, healthcare, or criminal justice reform, draw on Tubman's example of challenging the status quo. Her refusal to accept the injustice of slavery and her determination to create a world where all people could live free and with dignity provides the foundation for movements that challenge institutionalized racism, classism, and sexism. Tubman's influence also extends to the field of education. Her life story is often used in educational curricula to teach young people about the importance of resistance, community, and perseverance in the fight for justice. Schools and educational programs that focus on civil rights and social justice frequently turn to Tubman as an example of how one individual's actions can ignite widespread change. Her story is a testament to the idea that leadership is not about having the right title or authority, but about standing up for what is right and using your talents to serve the needs of others. Educators emphasize that Tubman's leadership was rooted in her deep belief in the inherent worth of every human being, and it is this commitment to human dignity that continues to inspire new generations of leaders. In the global context, Tubman's life and leadership continue to influence movements that address issues of global inequality and injustice. Her work on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people find their freedom, has been mirrored by contemporary movements that assist refugees, displaced people, and those facing persecution. Humanitarian organizations and activists working to end human trafficking, fight poverty, and provide relief to those affected by war and displacement often draw on Tubman's legacy as a symbol of the fight for freedom and human rights. Her ability to navigate and dismantle oppressive systems is an enduring example for those working to create a world in which all people can live free from the forces that seek to subjugate them. Harriet Tubman's leadership has transcended time, and her example continues to inform the work of activists, educators, and leaders who are fighting for a more just and equitable world. Her story teaches us that leadership is not always about holding power, but about making decisions that serve the common good and challenging systems that perpetuate inequality. Tubman's unwavering commitment to freedom, equality, and justice is a timeless example of the impact one individual can have in shaping history. In today's world, Tubman's life reminds us that true leadership is not just about leading others. It's about creating the conditions for others to be free and to live lives of dignity and opportunity. As we reach the conclusion of Harriet Tubman's remarkable life story, it is clear that her legacy continues to shape the world in profound and meaningful ways. From her work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad to her contributions as a nurse and spy during the Civil War, and from her advocacy for women's rights to her tireless efforts to fight systemic oppression, Harriet Tubman's life exemplifies the power of courage, determination, and selfless service. Today, Harriet Tubman's legacy is not confined to the pages of history books. It is a living, breathing testament to the enduring struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Her story continues to inspire people around the world, and her life's work remains a model for anyone committed to fighting against injustice. Tubman's unyielding belief in the possibility of a better world, her ability to act when others stood by, and her willingness to risk everything for the freedom of others have made her an icon in the ongoing fight for social change. Her legacy transcends the historical context in which she lived, speaking to the global struggles that continue to this day. Tubman's story has been embraced by movements for racial justice, gender equality, and human rights. Her work remains relevant as modern movements continue to confront issues of racial inequality, gender discrimination, economic injustice, and human trafficking. Harriet Tubman's example, once a symbol of resistance against slavery, is now a symbol of resistance against all forms of systemic oppression. In the 21st century, as social justice movements across the globe gain momentum, Harriet Tubman's life is invoked as a model for those who are fighting against the status quo. Whether it's the fight for racial justice in the wake of police violence, the global demand for women's rights, or the ongoing struggle for the rights of marginalized communities, Tubman's life stands as a beacon of hope. Her example is a powerful reminder that while the road to freedom and equality is long and difficult, the work is always worth it. The recognition of Tubman's legacy has come in many forms, from the establishment of national parks dedicated to her life's work to her inclusion on the $20 bill. Tubman's contributions to American society have been increasingly acknowledged. Statues, schools, and streets named after her serve as physical reminders of her impact, ensuring that future generations will learn from her courage and sacrifice. As her legacy continues to be honored, Harriet Tubman's name will forever be synonymous with the fight for freedom and justice. Yet, the recognition of Tubman's legacy is not just about the monuments and memorials that commemorate her life. It is about the ongoing work of justice and equality that she inspired. Tubman's life shows us that the struggle for freedom is a collective effort, and that every individual has the power to make a difference, no matter how daunting the task may seem. In today's world, as we face challenges like systemic racism, gender inequality, and economic disparity, Tubman's legacy reminds us that change is possible and that the work must continue. In the classroom, Tubman's story is shared with students who are learning about the history of the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, and the fight for civil rights. But her story also serves as a call to action for young people today, encouraging them to take up the mantle of activism and leadership in their own communities. Harriet Tubman's life is a lesson in how to turn personal adversity into a force for change, and how the courage to act, even when the odds seem insurmountable, can change the world. Her example continues to inspire activists and leaders in the ongoing fight for human rights and social justice. Tubman's work, particularly her role in freeing enslaved people through the Underground Railroad, is a model for today's efforts to address the modern-day challenges of human trafficking, forced migration, and refugee rights. Her story is a reminder that the fight for freedom is not a one-time event, but an ongoing effort that requires vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Moreover, Harriet Tubman's legacy has become a source of inspiration for women around the world, particularly women of color, who continue to fight for equality and representation. Tubman's leadership in the abolitionist movement and her role in advocating for women's suffrage in the late 19th century laid the groundwork for future generations of women who would carry on the struggle for gender equality. Tubman's ability to overcome the dual obstacles of race and gender in a deeply segregated and patriarchal society makes her a powerful role model for women leaders today, who face similar challenges in their own work for justice and equality. As we reflect on Harriet Tubman's life, it is clear that her legacy is not just about the past. It is about the future. Her contributions to the abolition of slavery, her leadership during the Civil War, and her lifelong commitment to justice and equality continue to inspire and guide those who work toward a more just and equitable world. Tubman's life was a testament to the power of one individual to change the course of history, and her legacy shows us that the fight for freedom is a continuous process, one that requires each of us to stand up and take action. As we look ahead, we carry Harriet Tubman's spirit with us. Her story is a powerful reminder that the pursuit of freedom, equality, and justice is not just a fight of the past. It is a fight that must continue, one generation after another. Harriet Tubman's legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who are determined to carry the torch she lit, ensuring that the flame of justice will never be extinguished.